My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son, sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. My name is Bernard. I am 75 years old, and for most of my life, the only thing I ever knew was hard work. I grew up in an era where nothing was handed to you, especially if you looked like me. I built a small trucking company in Atlanta from nothing but a single rusted rig and 2 calloused hands. I spent decades driving through the night, sleeping in truck stops, and breathing in diesel fumes just so my family would never have to know what hunger felt like. But on that Thursday night, the life I had built and the legacy I thought I was protecting shattered completely. It started with the bass, a heavy, vibrating thud that rattled the floorboards of my bedroom. I sat up in the dark, my old joints aching as the cold draft slipped through the window crack. I checked the clock on my nightstand. It was past midnight. I put on my worn slippers and grabbed my faded flannel robe, confused by the sound of clinking glasses and loud, arrogant laughter echoing from downstairs. This was my house. The sprawling 5-bedroom estate I had moved my son, Andre, and his wife, Chloe, into when his tech startup company hit a rough patch 2 years ago. I paid the mortgage. I paid the property taxes. I thought I was helping them get back on their feet. I thought that was what a father was supposed to do for his only child. I slowly made my way down the wide oak staircase. The music grew louder, mixing with the high-pitched, pretentious chatter of people I did not know. When I reached the bottom step, I froze in my tracks. The living room had been completely transformed. Waiters in crisp white shirts were passing around silver trays of expensive appetizers. Bottles of high-end liquor were lined up on the marble kitchen island that I had paid to install. And there, standing in the center of the room, holding a crystal glass of champagne, was my daughter-in-law, Chloe. She was wearing a designer silk dress, laughing loudly with her wealthy, elitist parents who had always looked at me like I was the hired help. Then I looked up. Hanging right across the large brick fireplace was a massive, professionally printed banner. The bold black letters felt like a physical blow to my chest. "Goodbye, freeloader. Do not come back." The room slowly went quiet as people started to notice me standing at the foot of the stairs. The music was suddenly turned down to a low murmur. Dozens of eyes turned my way, filled with a sickening mixture of pity, disgust, and amusement. I looked around for Andre, my own son, the boy I had worked 18-hour shifts to put through a private university, stood near the wet bar. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes, completely unable to meet my eyes. He was hiding, but Chloe did not look away. A cruel, triumphant smirk spread across her pale face. She set her crystal glass down on a table and walked toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She did not offer a word of explanation or an apology. She simply reached behind the designer sofa, pulled out 2 heavy black trash bags, and shoved them hard against my chest. I stumbled back half a step, the weight of the bags hitting my ribs. "Here you go, Bernard," she said, her voice dripping with venom so loudly that everyone in the room could hear her. "We packed up your rags for you. It is finally time for you to go. Andre and I need our space to entertain our real friends, and this house simply does not have room for dead weight anymore. The Uber we called to take you to the downtown shelter canceled, so you will just have to find your own way." A few of her relatives in the background actually chuckled. I stood there, holding the plastic bags containing my faded jeans, my old work shirts, and the few simple possessions I had left in the world. My heart pounded a heavy, painful rhythm against my chest. In that split second, a vivid memory flashed through my mind. I saw the face of my late wife, Vivian. On her deathbed 5 years ago, she had held my rough hand, her skin so frail and cold, and made me promise to always keep the family together. "Keep our boy safe, Bernard," she had whispered with her final breath. I had spent the last 5 years swallowing Chloe's daily insults, ignoring her condescending remarks about my clothes, and quietly fixing Andre's disastrous financial mistakes just to keep that sacred promise to my wife. But as I looked at my son, a grown man cowering behind his wife's blatant cruelty while my own home was stolen from under my feet, a hard truth settled in my soul. The family Vivian had wanted me to protect was already dead. The man standing at the bar was not my son. He was a parasite. I did not scream. I did not throw the bags at her face or demand an explanation. Anger is a loud, messy emotion, and I had learned a long time ago on the unforgiving streets of Atlanta that true power operates in absolute silence. I slowly reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out my smartphone. Chloe frowned, her confident smirk faltering just a fraction as I raised the camera. I made sure to get the offensive banner, the expensive caterers, her sneering face, and my son hiding in the background, all in one clear, wide-angle shot. The camera flash blinked, capturing their ultimate betrayal forever. "What are you doing, old man?" Chloe snapped, suddenly taking a step back, her voice tinged with a sudden defensiveness. I did not answer her. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, adjusted my grip on the heavy trash bags, and turned my back on the entire room. As I walked toward the heavy front door, I heard Andre finally speak up. "Dad, wait," he started, his voice weak and trembling. But Chloe immediately turned and shushed him. "Let the garbage take itself out," she scoffed loudly, ensuring the crowd heard her final punchline. I turned the brass knob, stepped outside, and pulled the door shut behind me, sealing myself out in the freezing dark. The winter wind cut right through my thin cotton robe, biting into my aged skin like tiny invisible needles. An icy rain had just begun to fall over the city, slicking the long driveway with a treacherous layer of sleet. My 75-year-old bones ached with the sudden drop in temperature, but I did not panic. I knew I still had my old, reliable Ford pickup truck parked out on the street. It was the first truck I ever bought, and I maintained the engine myself. I trudged down the winding driveway, the freezing slush seeping straight through my thin bedroom slippers. Every step sent a jolt of cold up my legs, my breath pluming in the freezing air like thick white smoke. I finally reached the street, opened the heavy door of my truck, and threw the trash bags into the passenger seat. I climbed behind the wheel, my hands shaking slightly from the bitter chill. I reached into the glove compartment where I always kept the spare key, slid it into the ignition, and turned it, expecting the familiar, comforting roar of the old engine. There was nothing, just a hollow, dead, clicking sound echoing in the cab. I tried again. Click, click, click. I frowned, popped the hood release lever, and stepped back out into the freezing, relentless rain. I lifted the heavy metal hood. Even in the dim, flickering light of the street lamp above, my experienced mechanic eyes saw the problem immediately. The spark plugs were completely gone. The wires had been neatly disconnected, pulled back, and zip-tied out of the way. This was not a mechanical breakdown. Chloe had actually paid someone to tamper with my engine. She had disabled my only mode of transportation while I was asleep in my bed. She did not just want to kick me out. She wanted to make sure I suffered. She wanted to force an old man to walk through the dangerous, freezing streets of South Atlanta in the middle of the night, hoping the cold or the streets would finish me off for good. I lowered the hood of the truck very gently, making sure it clicked shut. The icy rain was now soaking entirely through my robe, plastering the cold fabric to my shivering skin, but I no longer felt the chill of the weather. A deep, quiet, and terrifying fire had just ignited in the center of my chest. They thought I was just a tired, broken old man who would wander off into the dark and die quietly so they could inherit my kingdom. They had no idea what kind of monster they had just awakened. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. The freezing rain felt like broken glass against my skin as I walked away from the dead engine of my truck. I did not look back at the massive house shining with warm light in the distance. The house I bought. The house where my own son was laughing right now while drinking expensive champagne. I pulled my thin cotton robe tighter around my chest, but it was completely soaked through. The winter wind in Atlanta is unforgiving. It cuts straight through your clothes and settles deep into your bones. I had a 5-mile walk ahead of me to reach the south side of the city. 5 miles in freezing slush, wearing nothing but bedroom slippers and a robe. Every step was a battle. My 75-year-old knees ached with a dull, heavy pain. My slippers started to tear apart after the first mile. The wet concrete scraped against my bare heels, but I forced myself to keep moving. If I stopped walking, I knew I would freeze to death on the side of the road. Cars drove past me, splashing cold, dirty water against my legs. Not a single person slowed down. To them, I was just another homeless old man wandering the streets in the middle of the night. They did not know I had built a successful trucking company from nothing. They did not know I had spent 40 years sacrificing my own comfort so my son could wear custom suits and attend private schools. As the numbness spread from my toes up to my calves, my mind drifted back to my early days on the road. I survived long hauls across the country, sleeping in freezing truck cabins and eating cold canned food. I learned how to endure pain. I learned how to survive when the world turned its back on you. That survival instinct was the only reason I still had a place to go tonight. Decades ago, I bought a tiny rundown apartment in a forgotten neighborhood in South Atlanta. I used it as a resting spot between long trucking routes. When I retired and moved my family into the big estate, my son told me to sell the old apartment. He said it was an eyesore. He said it was beneath us. But something in my gut told me to keep it. A quiet voice whispering that a man should always have a place of his own just in case the world turns upside down. I never told anyone I kept the deed. It took me 3 hours to reach the old brick building. My feet were bleeding and my lips were cracked from the cold. I dragged myself up 3 flights of rusted metal stairs. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely retrieve the spare key hidden under a loose brick near the door. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stumbled inside. The air in the apartment was stale and smelled of dust and old memories. There was no electricity and no heat. The place had been empty for years. I found an old moth-eaten wool blanket in the bedroom closet. I wrapped it around my freezing body and collapsed onto the bare mattress. I did not sleep. I just lay there in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the thin glass windows, shivering uncontrollably while the reality of what my son had done slowly sank into my mind. When the gray morning light finally crept through the dusty window panes, I tried to sit up. A sudden sharp pain shot through the center of my chest. It was a crushing, heavy pressure like someone had dropped an anvil on my ribs. I gasped for air, clutching my chest. My heart condition, the stress of the betrayal and the freezing 5-mile walk had pushed my old heart right to the absolute limit. I needed my medication immediately. If I did not take my pills, I would have a massive heart attack before noon. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt like lead and my head was spinning. I found an old pair of heavy work boots and a faded denim jacket in a storage trunk. I put them on over my damp clothes and slowly made my way out of the apartment. There was a small neighborhood pharmacy 2 blocks away. Every step sent a fresh wave of pain through my chest, but I focused on my breathing. Just put one foot in front of the other. Do not let them break you. Do not let them win. I walked into the pharmacy. The bright fluorescent lights blinded me for a second. The pharmacist was a younger man. He looked at me with a mixture of concern and suspicion as I leaned heavily against the counter trying to catch my breath. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my health insurance card. It was the premium plan, the one I paid for every single month to ensure my entire family had the best medical coverage possible. I need a refill on my heart medication, I managed to say, my voice raspy and weak. It is an emergency. The pharmacist took the card and typed my information into his computer. He frowned and typed the numbers again. He looked at the screen and then looked back at me. I am sorry, sir. He said, his tone changing slightly. Your insurance provider says this policy was canceled. I stared at him. Canceled, I repeated. That is impossible. The premium is paid automatically from my account every month. Please try it again. He swiped the card through the machine. The machine beeped a harsh red tone. I am sorry, sir, he repeated. The system says the primary account holder terminated this coverage entirely late last night. The policy does not exist anymore. A cold chill washed over me that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. the primary account holder. I had put my son Andre in charge of the family accounts after my wife passed away because my eyesight was getting poor, and I trusted him to handle the paperwork. He had gone into the system last night while the party was happening. He did not just kick me out of my house. He canceled my life-saving medical insurance knowing full well about my heart condition. He was trying to ensure I did not survive the week. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. I needed to call the insurance company. I needed to fix this. I looked at the screen. No service. Emergency calls only. I tried to dial the customer service number anyway. The call failed instantly. I stared at the blank screen of my phone. He had disconnected my cellular service too. He had severed every single lifeline I had to the outside world. He wanted me sick, helpless, and completely isolated. The chest pain spiked again, forcing me to grip the edge of the counter to stay standing. How much for a 3-day supply out of pocket? I asked the pharmacist. He checked the system. $75, he replied. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. By some absolute miracle, I had folded a crisp $100 bill in there years ago and forgotten about it. I handed it to the young man. He gave me the pills and a small cup of water. I swallowed the medication right there in front of him, praying for my heart to slow down. I walked out of the pharmacy and stood on the sidewalk. The medication would keep me alive for 3 days, but I needed to buy food, turn on the electricity at the apartment, and secure legal help. I was not completely destitute. I had worked my entire life. I had a joint retirement savings account at the National Bank a few blocks away. It held $300,000 of hard-earned cash from my trucking business. I had added my son to the account years ago just in case anything ever happened to me, so he would not have to fight through probate court to pay for my funeral. I walked the 4 blocks to the bank. The wind was still biting, but the medicine was starting to ease the crushing weight in my chest. I stepped into the warm lobby of the bank and walked straight to the automated teller machine in the corner. I pulled my debit card from my wallet. My hands were steady now. The initial shock of the betrayal had passed. Now there was only cold, hard clarity. I slid the plastic card into the machine. I typed in my 4-digit PIN number. The screen loaded, offering me the usual menu options. I pressed the button to check my total account balance. I needed to withdraw $2,000 to get myself back on my feet and buy proper clothes. The screen loaded for a brief second, then the numbers appeared. Available balance, $0.00. I stood there staring at the glowing screen. I blinked, thinking my old eyes were playing tricks on me. I pressed the button to print a receipt. The machine whirred and spat out a small piece of white paper. I held it up to the light. $0.00. I pressed the button to view the recent transaction history. The screen refreshed, showing a single massive transfer that had taken place just 2 days ago. An electronic wire transfer moving exactly $300,000 out of the joint account and into a private offshore corporate account. An account belonging to the tech startup company owned by my son. He had drained every single penny of my life savings, the money I bled for, the money I saved by eating cheap food and driving broken trucks for 4 decades. He had taken it all to cover his own massive debts and left me with absolutely nothing. He had stolen my home, disabled my vehicle, canceled my health insurance, cut off my phone, and emptied my bank account. He and his arrogant wife thought they had completely erased me from existence. They thought they had successfully disposed of an old man who was too weak and too tired to fight back. I took the printed receipt from the machine and folded it neatly, putting it into my pocket. I did not cry. I did not scream. I pulled the collar of my faded denim jacket up against the cold and walked out of the bank and back into the freezing streets of Atlanta. My son thought he had broken me. He thought he had played the final winning move. But he forgot one very important thing about the man who raised him. I built my entire life from nothing but dirt and struggle. I knew how to fight in the dark. And I was about to show them exactly what happens when you leave a starving wolf out in the cold. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. I stood outside the bank with nothing but the wet clothes on my back and a crumpled receipt that proved my own son had robbed me blind. The winter air in Atlanta was relentless. It whipped down the concrete sidewalks, making my eyes water and my hands shake. I had exactly $25 left in my pocket from the cash I used to buy my heart medicine. $25 to my name after 40 years of breaking my back, pulling double shifts, and sacrificing every luxury a man could want. I was starving. My stomach gnawed at my ribs, but I knew I could not waste a single dollar on food right now. I needed an ally. I needed the one man in this city who knew how to hunt down stolen money. I walked 3 blocks down the avenue until I found an old gas station. Tucked near the side of the brick building was a rusted payphone. It was a relic from another time just like me. I dropped some coins into the slot and dialed a number I had memorized decades ago. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, gruff voice answered. It was Dexter. Dexter and I went way back to the days before I even owned my first truck. He was a retired forensic accountant. For 30 years, he worked for the biggest firms in the state, tracking down hidden assets, offshore accounts, and corporate fraud. He was a proud black man who took no nonsense from anyone, and he was the only person in the world I trusted right now. I told him I was at the corner of 5th and Main and that I needed help. I did not have to explain the desperation in my voice. Dexter simply told me to stay put and hung up. 10 minutes later, a dark sedan pulled up to the curb. The passenger door opened and a wave of glorious, warm air hit my freezing face. I climbed inside. Dexter took one look at my soaked clothes, my shivering hands, and my pale face. He did not ask any pointless questions. He just turned up the heater and drove us straight to his house in the suburbs. When we walked into his warm living room, his wife made me a plate of hot food and poured me a large mug of black coffee. I ate the food quickly. It was the first meal I had eaten in over 24 hours, and I could feel my strength slowly returning. I sat at his kitchen table and explained everything. I told him about the party, the banner, the trash bags, and the freezing walk. Then I pulled the crumpled bank receipt from my pocket and slid it across the wooden table. I told him my entire life savings was gone and my health insurance was canceled. Dexter looked at the piece of paper and his eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened with a quiet fury. He told me to follow him down the hall to his home office. The room was filled with filing cabinets and a large desk holding 3 computer monitors. Dexter might have been retired, but he still had back doors into the financial networks and credit bureaus from his days as a top-tier auditor. He sat down in his leather chair and cracked his knuckles. He asked for my social security number and my banking details. I gave them to him, and then I stood behind his chair watching as his fingers flew across the keyboard. The screens lit up with lines of code and financial databases. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of the keys. I felt a heavy knot in my chest. Part of me was terrified to see the truth in black and white. Part of me still wanted to believe there was some mistake. But a man does not survive in this world by hiding from the truth. Dexter finally stopped typing. He leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. He pointed to the screen on the left. He told me he found the $300,000. He tracked the wire transfer through a dummy corporation set up just a week ago. But the money did not stay there. It was immediately funneled into the business accounts of a high-end fashion boutique in Buckhead. I recognized the name of the boutique instantly. It belonged to Chloe. Dexter explained that the boutique had been secretly failing for the past 8 months. She was bleeding money trying to maintain an illusion of wealth to impress her elitist friends and family. She had massive debts to clothing suppliers, and the landlord was threatening to evict her store. So she convinced my son to steal the money I bled for just to save her vanity project. She took my retirement fund to buy designer shoes and silk dresses while I was left to freeze on the streets. The anger burning inside me grew hotter, but Dexter was not finished. He turned to the screen on the right. His voice grew very quiet. He told me that the stolen money was just the beginning. He had dug into the financial records of my son's tech startup. The company had lost its major investors 3 months ago and was on the verge of total bankruptcy. But magically, just last week, the company received a massive injection of capital. $2 million from a private corporate lender. I asked Dexter how my son could possibly secure a $2 million loan with a failing company and no collateral. Dexter clicked a file and opened a scanned document on the screen. It was the master loan agreement. I leaned in close to look at the paperwork. My heart stopped. Right there at the bottom of the page was my name, Bernard, listed as the primary guarantor of the loan. And right next to my printed name was my signature. I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The signature looked exactly like mine. The loops and the angles were perfect, but I had never signed that document. I had never even seen that document in my life. Andre had forged my signature. He used my immaculate credit history and my flawless financial standing to secure a massive loan for his dying business. He did not just steal the money I already had, he mortgaged my entire future. If his company went under, I would be legally responsible for $2 million. The bank would seize my trucking company assets, my properties, and everything I had ever built. My own flesh and blood had sold me into absolute ruin to save his own skin. I stepped back from the desk and ran my hands over my tired face. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to comprehend. My son had planned this meticulously. He canceled my insurance and threw me out of the house, hoping the shock and the cold would trigger my heart condition. He wanted me to die quietly on the streets before I could ever discover the massive fraud he had committed. With me dead, the life insurance would pay off the debt, and he would inherit the rest of my estate free and clear. It was a perfect, cold-blooded execution. Dexter stood up and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. He told me that we had enough evidence to make them sweat. The electronic trail leading to the boutique was undeniable. The forged signature was a federal crime, but Dexter warned me that taking this to the police right now would be a mistake. Andre was smart. He had expensive lawyers. If we walked into a precinct with just these digital printouts, Andre would claim that I had verbally authorized the transfers and the loan. He would claim that my old age and my supposed failing memory were to blame. It would turn into a massive, drawn-out legal battle in civil court, a battle I did not have the money or the time to fight. Dexter looked me dead in the eye. He said that if I wanted to crush them completely and send them to federal prison without a shadow of a doubt, we needed something stronger. We needed the original documents. More specifically, we needed the black leather financial ledger that my late wife Vivian used to keep. Vivian was a meticulous woman. Before she passed away, she recorded every single authorized account number, every legitimate signature sample, and every detail of the blind trust she helped me set up years ago. That ledger contained the exact dates and the exact legal parameters of my estate. If we had that ledger, the fraud would be irrefutable. It would prove that Andre had zero legal authority to sign anything on my behalf. It would be the silver bullet that would destroy his entire defense before he even stepped into a courtroom. I nodded slowly. I knew exactly where the black leather ledger was. Vivian had given it to me right before she died and told me to keep it safe. But the realization of what I had to do next hit me like a physical blow. The ledger was not in my rundown apartment. It was not in a bank vault. It was locked inside the heavy steel wall safe located deep inside the walk-in closet of the master bedroom of the sprawling estate I had just been banished from. The very same house that was currently occupied by my treacherous son and his arrogant wife. The house where I was no longer welcome. The house where they would undoubtedly call the police and have me arrested for trespassing if they saw my face anywhere near the property. I had no keys. I had no vehicle. And my son thought he had changed all the security codes to keep me out permanently. But Andre was a foolish young man who relied too much on modern technology. He forgot that I was the man who built that estate. I was the man who supervised the installation of every wire and every lock. And I knew a secret about that house that he did not. I looked at Dexter and told him to print every single document he had found. I told him I was going back into the lion's den. I was going to break into my own home and take back the weapon I needed to destroy them. The war had officially begun, and I was not going to show any mercy. It was Tuesday morning. I knew my daughter-in-law's routine better than she thought I did. Every Tuesday at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, she left the house for a 3-hour session at a luxury day spa in the wealthy district of Buckhead. My son Andre would be at his rented office space across town, desperately trying to pretend his startup company was not drowning in debt. The house would be completely empty. Dexter offered to drive me to the estate, but I told him to drop me off 2 miles down the road. I did not want his vehicle spotted on any of the neighborhood security cameras. I wore the same faded denim jacket and heavy work boots I had salvaged from my old apartment. My chest still ached from the physical toll of the last few days, but the medication was keeping my heart steady. I walked the last 2 miles, feeling the cold, familiar pavement under my feet. This was my neighborhood. I had planted the massive oak trees lining the street. Now I had to sneak into my own property like a common thief. I reached the tall iron security gates at the end of the long driveway. Andre had changed the digital gate code, of course. But 10 years ago, when the security company installed the perimeter system, I had the head technician wire a physical master bypass switch hidden deep inside the waterproof casing of the intercom box. I reached up, popped the plastic cover loose, slid my fingers inside the cold metal housing and flipped the hidden toggle switch. The heavy iron gates hummed to life and swung open silently. I walked up the long brick driveway, staying close to the manicured hedges to avoid the front door cameras. I made my way around to the back patio. The security keypad on the heavy oak back door was glowing red. Again, Andre thought he was clever by simply changing the digital PIN number. He did not know that the alarm system had a hardwired factory master code that could never be deleted by a user. I punched in the 6-digit sequence I had memorized a decade ago. The light turned green and the heavy deadbolt clicked open. I stepped into the massive kitchen. The house was dead quiet. The polished marble floors gleamed in the morning light and the air smelled heavily of expensive vanilla candles. The remnants of the cruel party they threw to celebrate my eviction had been completely cleaned away, probably by an expensive maid service paid for with my stolen retirement money. I did not waste time looking around at the luxury I had financed. I walked straight out of the kitchen, up the wide oak staircase, and down the long carpeted hallway to the master bedroom. It felt incredibly strange, standing in the room I had shared with my late wife Vivian for so many years. Chloe had completely redecorated it, erasing every single trace of our life together. The walls were painted a sterile, cold white, but she could not erase the heavy steel wall safe hidden behind the full-length mirror inside the massive walk-in closet. I slid the heavy mirror aside. The safe required a biometric thumbprint and a manual combination to open. Andre had wiped my fingerprint from the digital system, but he was too arrogant and too lazy to change the manual combination dial. I spun the heavy cold metal dial to the left, to the right, and back to the left. The internal tumblers clicked perfectly into place. I grabbed the handle and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside, sitting right where I had left it years ago, was the worn black leather financial ledger. I reached in and pulled it out, feeling the familiar rough texture of the cover. My wife's immaculate handwriting was waiting inside, holding the absolute key to their destruction. I tucked the heavy book securely inside my denim jacket, zipping it up to my chin, and closed the safe door. I was just sliding the mirror back into place when I heard the unmistakable sound of the heavy front door opening downstairs. My blood ran completely cold. It was barely 10 in the morning. Chloe was not supposed to be back for another 2 hours. I stood perfectly still in the closet, holding my breath and listening. High heels clicked sharply against the marble floor of the foyer. A loud, commanding voice called out, asking if anyone was home. It was not Chloe. It was her mother. The same arrogant woman who had laughed at my expense during the party while drinking my champagne. I had to get out immediately. I slipped out of the master bedroom and moved silently down the back staircase that led directly to the ground floor utility room. My plan was to slip out the side service door before she even knew someone was in the house. But as I stepped onto the tile floor of the utility room, the side door suddenly pushed open and Chloe's mother walked right in from the garage. She froze instantly when she saw me standing there. I braced myself for her to scream or call the police. I was a strange man standing inside her daughter's house uninvited. But she did not scream. She stood there and looked me up and down, taking in my faded denim jacket, my worn-out dirty work boots, and my weathered aging face. I watched the gears turn inside her mind. Her prejudiced, arrogant brain simply could not process that the man she had mocked a few nights ago was standing right in front of her. Because I was not wearing a tailored suit, she did not recognize me at all. To her, I was just another old black man in dirty work clothes. "Oh, thank goodness you are finally here," she sighed, in a loud, exasperated tone, waving her hand dismissively. Chloe told me the landscaping company was sending a new groundskeeper today. I did not realize they hired men quite so past their prime. I stood there staring at her. The sheer ignorance of her assumption hit me like a physical blow, but my survival instinct immediately took over. If I corrected her, she would realize exactly who I was and call the police to have me arrested for trespassing. If I played along, I could walk right out the front gates with the ledger securely hidden inside my jacket. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly low and keeping my head slightly bowed. I swallowed every single ounce of my pride in that moment. It tasted like ash in my mouth. "I am just checking the utility meters, ma'am." "Well, do not just stand there," she snapped. opening her expensive designer handbag. She pulled out a crisp $10 bill and tossed it onto the washing machine next to me. The garbage in the kitchen needs to go out immediately. It smells like cheap seafood from that terrible caterer they hired for the party. Take the bags out to the curb on your way out and make sure the rose bushes are properly trimmed before noon. I looked at the $10 bill sitting on the cold metal machine. 40 years of building a successful logistics business, employing hundreds of men, and earning my rightful place in this world had been reduced to a $10 tip for taking out my own garbage in my own house. I reached out, picked up the paper bill, and shoved it deep into my pocket. "Yes, ma'am," I said softly. I walked past her and stepped into the kitchen. I grabbed the heavy black garbage bag sitting by the walk-in pantry. The smell of rotting luxury food and stale wine hit my nose. I carried the heavy bag out the side door and walked down the long driveway toward the street. Every step felt like a massive weight pressing down on my soul. But I had the ledger. I had the ultimate weapon. The humiliation was just the temporary price of admission to a war they could not possibly win. I reached the large collection bins sitting by the curb at the end of the driveway. I lifted the heavy plastic lid to throw the garbage bag inside. As the bag dropped into the deep bin, it caught the sharp edge of another clear plastic bag already sitting at the bottom, tearing it completely open. A massive pile of shredded white paper spilled out across the bottom of the bin. Something caught my eye immediately. The paper was heavy stock. It was the exact kind of expensive, thick legal paper corporate lawyers use for official property documents. I reached down into the dirty bin and pulled out a handful of the shredded strips. I looked closely at the pieces in the morning light. Whoever used the shredder had fed the paper in horizontally instead of vertically, so entire sentences were still perfectly legible on some of the longer strips. My heart started to race as I read the broken legal terminology printed on the paper. Grantor Bernard, grantee Chloe, full transfer of property rights, irrevocable deed of trust. I did not throw the garbage away. I reached deep into the bin, grabbed the entire torn bag of shredded documents, and tied it shut tightly. I carried the bag of paper with me, walking down the street until I was completely out of sight of the estate. I sat on a wooden bus bench 2 miles away and started piecing the strips together on my lap like a sick, twisted puzzle. It took me an hour to confirm what my gut already knew. They were not just satisfied with stealing my entire retirement fund to save her boutique. They had been practicing forging my signature on a master property deed. They were drafting illegal documents to completely transfer the ownership of the entire multi-million-dollar estate solely into Chloe's name. They wanted to steal the very ground I had purchased to protect my family. They had crossed the final legal line. There was absolutely no going back now. They did not just want me homeless and dead. They wanted to erase my legacy entirely and claim it as their own. I touched the cold leather of the ledger hidden against my chest. They wanted a war over pieces of paper and bank accounts. I was going to give them a war they would never survive. I walked away from that wealthy neighborhood with the heavy leather ledger pressed against my chest and a plastic garbage bag full of shredded paper gripped tightly in my hand. I did not look back at the massive iron gates. I did not look back at the life I had built and lost. I walked for 2 miles until I reached a public bus stop on the edge of the district. I sat down on the cold wooden bench and waited. The freezing rain had finally stopped, but the chill remained deep in my bones. I held the plastic bag on my lap, staring through the clear plastic at the torn strips of heavy legal paper. They had planned to erase me entirely. They had sat in the house I paid for, drinking the wine I bought, and calmly drafted legal documents to steal my legacy. I took the city bus back to the south side of Atlanta. I met Dexter at a small rundown diner off the highway. We sat in a corner booth far away from the windows. I ordered a black coffee and placed the black leather ledger on the sticky Formica table. Then I reached into the plastic bag and pulled out the taped-together pieces of the forged property deed. I slid them across the table. Dexter looked at the documents, and his eyes went wide. He slowly shook his head, his jaw tight with silent anger. He did not say a word to me. He simply pulled out his cell phone and made one phone call. His voice was low and urgent. He told the person on the other end of the line that we needed an immediate meeting. He said it was a matter of total financial annihilation. 2 hours later, Dexter and I were walking through the polished marble lobby of a towering glass high-rise building in downtown Atlanta. My faded denim jacket and dirty work boots drew disgusted looks from the wealthy businessmen in their expensive tailored suits. The security guards eyed me with heavy suspicion, but Dexter flashed a premium access card and we stepped into the private elevator. We rode up to the 42nd floor. This was the absolute peak of the city. This was the territory of corporate predators and legal assassins, and I was there to hire the deadliest one of them all. Her name was Roxanne. She was a tall, striking black woman dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit. She stood behind a massive polished mahogany desk, looking out over the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. When we walked into her massive corner office, she did not smile. She did not offer us water or coffee. She did not waste a single second on polite conversation. She simply turned around, looked at my dirty clothes, and told me to sit down and show her exactly what I had brought. I sat in the plush leather chair. I placed the black ledger on her desk. I laid out the bank receipts showing my drained retirement account. I laid out the loan documents featuring my perfectly forged signature. And finally, I placed the taped-together pieces of the fraudulent property deed right in the center of the desk. Roxanne sat down, put on a pair of silver reading glasses, and leaned forward. For 20 long minutes, the only sound in that massive office was the steady ticking of her antique wall clock and the crisp sound of pages turning. She read every single line. She examined every single date. When she finally looked up, her eyes were completely cold and calculating. She took off her glasses and folded her hands together. She told me that 99% of people in my situation would make a massive mistake right now. They would let their anger take control. They would go to the police station, file a report, and start a loud, messy public lawsuit. They would scream and shout and demand justice. But Roxanne warned me that a loud lawsuit is the worst thing you can do to a smart enemy. A loud lawsuit gives the enemy time to hide their stolen cash. It gives them time to hire defense attorneys and drag the process out through civil courts for years until you run out of money and die. Roxanne did not believe in loud lawsuits. She believed in the silent gunshot, the kind of shot the enemy never hears coming until they are already bleeding out on the floor. She opened the black leather ledger to a specific page marked by my late wife Vivian. Roxanne asked me if my son Andre actually understood the specific legal structure of my estate. I shook my head. I told her that Vivian and I had set up the estate 10 years ago, but we never discussed the complicated legal details with our son. We simply told him the house would be his one day. Roxanne smiled for the very first time. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. She pointed to a sequence of legal codes written in my wife's elegant handwriting. She explained that years ago I did not just put the massive estate in my own personal name. Acting on the advice of top financial planners, I had placed the house, the surrounding land, and all the physical assets into an irrevocable blind trust. I was the sole living beneficiary and the absolute controller of that trust. Andre had no legal standing whatsoever. The forged deed he was desperately trying to piece together was completely and utterly useless. You cannot transfer a property out of a blind trust without the physical presence, the verified biometric signature, and the direct authorization of the primary trustee, which was me. Roxanne leaned back in her chair and laid out the reality of the situation. Andre was deeply drowning in corporate debt. His investors were threatening to destroy him. He was trying to take out a massive multi-million-dollar home equity loan against the mansion to save his failing tech startup and pay off his furious investors. The National Bank was scheduled to finalize and fund that loan at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. If that loan went through, Andre would walk away with millions in stolen cash, and I would be left holding a massive fraudulent debt that would ruin me forever. But Roxanne had a different plan. She called it Operation Freeze. We sat in her quiet office and watched the antique clock on the wall. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every passing minute felt like an hour. I thought about the freezing rain. I thought about the trash bags hitting my chest. I thought about the smirk on Chloe's face as she told me to leave my own home. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm. I was ready. At exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes past noon, 15 minutes before the bank was scheduled to release the funds, Roxanne picked up her office phone. She dialed the direct private line of the senior legal counsel for the National Bank. She put the phone on speaker so I could hear everything. When the executive answered, Roxanne did not yell or threaten. Her voice was smooth and deadly. She simply informed the executive that their downtown branch was about to authorize a multi-million-dollar loan based on fraudulent documents and a forged signature. The executive immediately got defensive, claiming their verification process was flawless. Roxanne hit a button on her keyboard. She sent over the digital proof of the irrevocable blind trust, the verified signature samples from the ledger, and a copy of an emergency federal injunction she had filed digitally just 10 minutes prior. She spoke into the phone with absolute authority. She warned the bank executive that if his branch released a single penny of that money to Andre, they would be heavily investigated by the federal government as an active accessory to felony wire fraud. The execution was immediate and absolute. We listened to the silence on the other end of the line as the executive reviewed the files. We could hear the panic setting in as he realized the massive legal liability his bank was about to walk into. He frantically typed on his keyboard and shouted orders to someone in the background. He told Roxanne the loan was instantly terminated, but the silent gunshot did not stop there. Because Andre had used fraudulent documents for a massive corporate loan, the bank system automatically flagged his entire financial portfolio for suspected criminal fraud. Within 60 seconds, the bank initiated a total lockdown. We listened as the executive confirmed the actions. They froze every single account attached to my son's name. His personal checking accounts were locked. His corporate startup accounts were completely frozen. Even the luxury boutique accounts belonging to his arrogant wife were entirely suspended pending a federal review. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my son Andre walked up to a private banking teller expecting to receive millions of dollars to save his miserable life. Instead, he was handed a piece of paper stating his accounts were under federal investigation and his credit cards were completely worthless. He was cut off from the world in the blink of an eye. I stood by the massive glass window of Roxanne's office looking down at the tiny cars moving through the streets of Atlanta. I felt a strange, profound sense of calm. The kind of dead calm that settles over a battlefield after the artillery stops firing. I had just financially decapitated my own son. He had thrown me out into the freezing rain to die so he could steal my kingdom. Now he was a king with no castle, no money, and absolutely no future. He was entirely trapped. But Roxanne stepped up beside me and crossed her arms. She did not look celebratory. She looked cautious. She warned me that a desperate man is a highly dangerous man. Andre was not just going to accept defeat and walk away quietly. He had ruthless corporate investors breathing down his neck, threatening to ruin his life. He had a shallow, greedy wife who would abandon him the very second the money dried up. He had nothing left to lose. She was exactly right. 2 hours after we left the office, Dexter called my burner phone. He still had his ears low to the ground in the gritty streets of South Atlanta. He told me that Andre had completely lost his mind when the bank locked the doors on him. My son realized immediately that only one person possessed the power and the knowledge to trigger that specific legal freeze. He knew I was not dead in the streets. He knew I was alive, and he knew I was fighting back. But instead of feeling remorse or surrendering, Andre doubled down on his evil. Dexter warned me that my son had just visited a very dark, dangerous part of the city. He used the last of his hidden physical cash to hire 3 local street fixers. These were violent, unpredictable men who specialized in finding people who did not want to be found. Andre was no longer trying to quietly steal my money behind my back. He was actively hunting me down. The clean legal war in the high-rise offices had just turned into a dirty physical war in the streets, and I was standing right in the center of the crosshairs. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read "Goodbye Freeloader" and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son, sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. I sat in the dark of my old South Side apartment listening to the rain beat against the thin glass window. Dexter had warned me that my son hired violent men to hunt me down in the streets. I knew those kinds of men. They were ruthless and hungry, but they were also impatient. I did not leave the apartment for 2 days. I survived on canned soup and the bottled water Dexter had brought me. My chest still ached from the physical toll of the cold night, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I knew my son and his wife. They were arrogant, but they were cowards at heart. When the street thugs failed to locate me within 48 hours, I knew Chloe would inevitably resort to the dirtiest weapon she had. She would try to use the legal system to strip me of my basic human rights. I remembered the way she used to look at me across the dinner table. She always spoke to me slowly and loudly as if I were a slow child. She rolled her eyes whenever I told a story about my trucking days. She wanted me to be a feeble-minded old man so badly that she convinced herself it was true. And now she was going to use that fabricated delusion to destroy me. She knew that if I was declared legally incompetent by the state the bank freeze Roxanne initiated would be thrown out of court. Andre would immediately be granted emergency medical power of attorney. He would gain complete, absolute control over the blind trust my health decisions and my life. They could lock me in a psychiatric ward and throw away the key while they drained my estate dry. But they forgot that I had spent 40 years running a logistics company. I survived in business by anticipating the obstacles on the road miles before I ever reached them. The morning after Roxanne locked down the bank accounts, Dexter drove me to a highly respected private psychiatric clinic on the north side of the city. I spent 4 hours sitting in a sterile white room answering complex cognitive questions, taking memory tests, and undergoing a complete psychological evaluation by a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist. I paid for the expedited results with the last of the cash Dexter loaned me. The doctor handed me a certified, notarized document stating that my cognitive function was absolutely pristine. My memory was flawless, and my decision-making capacity was fully intact. I took that document back to my dark apartment and placed it on the kitchen table right next to the black leather ledger and the forged loan documents. Then I simply sat in the chair and waited for the dogs to come biting. The ambush happened just after dawn on Thursday morning. It started with a loud, aggressive pounding on the thin wooden door of my apartment. The heavy knocks shook the door frame. I did not flinch. I slowly stood up from the kitchen chair and smoothed down the front of my faded denim jacket. I walked to the door and pulled it open. I expected to see the street fixers Andre had hired. Instead, I was met by the blinding glare of police flashlights. 2 uniformed city police officers stood in the narrow hallway, resting their hands on their heavy utility belts. Standing right between them was a middle-aged white woman holding a thick clipboard. She wore a badge around her neck, identifying her as a senior investigator for Adult Protective Services. "Are you Bernard?" she asked. Her voice was stern, but it carried that sickening tone of artificial pity people use when they speak to the helpless. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I was. The officers immediately stepped inside the apartment uninvited, forcing me to back up into the small living room. They looked around the bare, dusty space, assessing me as a potential physical threat. The woman from Adult Protective Services stepped in behind them and closed the door. She looked at my worn clothes and the sparse furniture with a grim expression. "Bernard," she said slowly, enunciating every single syllable. "We received a very concerning emergency report from your daughter-in-law, Chloe. She stated that you are suffering from severe late-stage dementia. She reported that you became violently confused a few nights ago, wandered away from your secure home, and have been living in squalor. She filed a sworn affidavit stating that you are a danger to yourself and to the public. We are here to take you into state custody for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. You will be placed in a secure medical facility until a judge can transfer your legal guardianship over to your son, Andre." I stood in the center of the room, listening to the absolute poison my daughter-in-law had poured into the ears of the state. She had painted me as a violent, insane animal that needed to be caged. If I had reacted with anger right then, if I had raised my voice or cursed at them, I would have given them exactly what they needed. The police would have tackled me to the floor, placed me in handcuffs, and dragged me into an ambulance. The trap was perfectly set. But anger is a tool for the weak. Silence and preparation are the weapons of the strong. I did not yell. I did not raise my hands. I simply nodded my head slowly. I told the woman that I understood her concern and that I appreciated the difficult job she had to do. I asked her in a calm, quiet voice if I could show her some paperwork sitting on my kitchen table before the officers placed their hands on me. The officers tensed up, but the woman nodded and instructed them to let me walk to the table. I picked up the manila folder I had prepared. I opened it and handed her the crisp white pages of the psychiatric evaluation I had completed less than 24 hours ago. I watched her face as her eyes scanned the official letterhead, the doctor's signature, and the definitive medical conclusion stating my mind was completely sound and highly functional. Her brow furrowed in deep confusion. Then I handed her the bank receipts showing the complete drainage of my retirement account into her boutique business. Then I handed her the corporate loan documents clearly showing my forged signature. And finally I placed the heavy black leather ledger on the table and opened it to the page containing my true, verified signature standing in stark contrast to the sloppy forgery my son had created. I stood perfectly still as the silence in the room grew heavy and thick. The woman from Adult Protective Services read through the documents. I watched her professional pity transform into absolute shock and then into a deep, burning outrage. She was not a fool. She dealt with elder abuse every single day of her life. She realized in a matter of seconds that she was not looking at a confused, violent man suffering from dementia. She was looking at a completely competent victim of massive financial fraud. She realized that Chloe had weaponized a government agency and lied to the police just to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal crime. She looked up at me, her face pale with embarrassment and anger. She handed the documents back to me very carefully. She told the police officers to stand down and step back. She apologized to me with genuine shame in her voice. She promised me that she would personally file an aggravated false reporting charge against Chloe before the day was over. She told me that I was completely free and that she was deeply sorry for invading my home. For a brief moment I felt a surge of victory. I had beaten their dirtiest trick. I had turned their own weapon against them. But my son Andre was a desperate rat backed into a corner, and rats always have one last trick hidden in the dark. As the woman from Adult Protective Services turned to leave the apartment, the older of the two police officers cleared his throat. He did not look apologetic. He reached into his heavy uniform jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick yellow paper. He stepped forward and handed it to me. "I am glad your mental health is in order," Bernard the officer said, his voice cold and flat. "But that does not change the legal directive we were given this morning. This is a temporary emergency restraining order signed by a superior court judge just 2 hours ago. Your son Andre filed a sworn declaration claiming you broke into his private residence, threatened his life, and attempted to steal his business documents." I stared down at the yellow paper in my hands. The black ink spelled out the ultimate insult. The officer continued speaking, reading the strict parameters of the court order. "You are legally forbidden from making any contact with your son or your daughter-in-law. You are forbidden from calling them, messaging them, or using third parties to communicate with them. And most importantly, you are strictly banned from coming within 500 feet of the estate in Buckhead. If you are seen anywhere near that property, you will be immediately arrested and jailed for violating a direct court order." The police officers turned around and walked out of my apartment, leaving me alone in the quiet, dusty room. I looked down at the official court seal stamped on the bottom of the restraining order. My son had used the shredded documents and my brief presence in the house against me. He went to a judge, played the terrified victim, and legally banished me from the very land I owned. He had placed a physical and legal wall between me and my property. I walked over to the small window and looked down at the wet city streets below. They thought this restraining order would stop me. They thought that keeping me away from the physical house would save them from the financial slaughter that was coming. They still did not understand the gravity of the mistake they had made. I did not need to step foot inside that house to destroy it. I did not need to be anywhere near them to bring their entire fake kingdom crashing down on their heads. The legal war over the property was locked in a stalemate, but there was another angle they had completely forgotten to cover. I walked back to the kitchen table and picked up my burner phone. I dialed Dexter's number. I told him we were no longer playing defense. I told him it was time to peel away their shiny armor and expose the rot underneath to the entire world. They wanted to use the law to lock me out of my own life. I was going to use the federal government to lock them in a cage they could never escape. It was time to introduce my arrogant daughter-in-law to the Internal Revenue Service. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my sons sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. I sat in the passenger seat of Dexter's car, staring at the yellow restraining order resting on my lap. 500 feet. My son thought a simple signature on a piece of paper was a magic shield. He truly believed that by putting a legal wall between me and the physical estate, he had won the war. He did not realize that I had absolutely no desire to go back to that house right now. I did not want the walls or the roof or the fancy marble floors. I wanted the foundation they stood on to completely crumble beneath their feet. Legally barred from my own property, I realized it was time to change my strategy. If I could not touch their physical assets, I was going to systematically destroy the one thing they valued more than anything else in the world. I was going to destroy their pride and their public image. Dexter drove us back to his suburban home in total silence. His home office was already filled with new stacks of printed documents. Dexter was a hound that never stopped hunting once he caught a scent. He told me to sit down at the desk and look at the financial history of my daughter-in-law's luxury boutique. I already knew she had stolen my retirement money to keep her store afloat, but Dexter had dug much deeper into the dark corners of her business. He had hacked into the state tax registry and cross-referenced her inventory purchases with her reported retail sales. It was a textbook case of massive corporate tax evasion. Chloe was not just a terrible business owner who was bleeding cash. She was an active criminal. She was keeping two entirely separate sets of accounting books. She was selling expensive designer bags and custom dresses to her wealthy elite friends for raw cash, and she was never reporting a single dime of that income to the federal government. At the very same time, she was claiming massive, fake business losses to avoid paying any corporate taxes whatsoever. She was writing off luxury vacations, spa treatments, and expensive dinners as mandatory business expenses. And whenever her illegal accounting did not balance out, she was using my stolen retirement money to quietly plug the holes. She was stealing from an old man to cover up the fact that she was stealing from the federal government. The government does not care about family drama or personal betrayals. The government only cares about its money. Dexter and I spent the entire night compiling every single piece of undeniable evidence. We printed out her hidden bank statements, the fake supplier invoices, and the exact dates of her illegal cash deposits. We organized everything into a massive binder highlighting every single federal violation. We placed the binder and the supporting documents into a thick manila envelope. We did not put a return address on it. We addressed it directly to the regional director of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. But I was not going to let my son sit comfortably in his rented office while his wife took the fall. Andre was just as guilty, and his pride was wrapped up entirely in his failing tech startup. He had forged my signature to secure a $2 million corporate loan. The bank had already frozen his accounts thanks to my lawyer Roxanne, but his private investors were completely in the dark. They still believed Andre was a genius chief executive officer who was going to make them rich. I sat at Dexter's computer and created a secure, untraceable email address. I drafted a very simple, completely factual message. I attached the high-resolution scans of the forged loan documents, the undeniable proof of my true signature from my late wife's ledger, and the official bank rejection notice confirming the federal fraud investigation. I hit send, forwarding that email directly to the private inboxes of the 5 biggest financial investors sitting on his corporate board of directors. The next morning, I walked 2 miles to the main city post office and dropped the thick manila envelope meant for the federal investigators into the blue collection box. I listened to the heavy thud as it hit the bottom of the metal bin. That sound was the final nail in their coffin. There was no lawyer expensive enough to save them from what was coming next. We did not have to wait long. The federal government moves very slowly until they smell blood in the water. Then they move like lightning. 3 days later, it was a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon. Chloe was hosting an exclusive champagne brunch event at her boutique in the wealthy district of Buckhead. All of her elite socialite friends were in attendance. These were the exact same arrogant women who had stood in my living room and laughed at me while I held my worn-out clothes in trash bags. Dexter and I parked his dark sedan across the street from the boutique, blending in perfectly with the busy weekend traffic. We sat in the car drinking black coffee and watching the front doors of the shop. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 unmarked black sport utility vehicles pulled up directly in front of the boutique storefront blocking the street. The doors swung open simultaneously, and 12 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Internal Revenue Service printed on the back stepped out onto the sidewalk. They did not knock politely on the glass, they did not ask for permission to enter, they pushed through the heavy double doors of the boutique with absolute terrifying authority. Through the large front windows of the store, I watched the absolute panic unfold. The wealthy women dropped their expensive champagne glasses, shattering them on the polished floor. The federal agents immediately ordered everyone to step away from the merchandise and put their hands where they could be seen. They began taping up boxes of financial records and confiscating the cash registers and computers. And right in the center of the total chaos was Chloe. Her confident, arrogant face was completely drained of color. She looked like a ghost. She was screaming at the armed agents, telling them they were making a massive mistake and threatening to call her expensive lawyers to have them all fired. The lead federal investigator did not argue with her. He simply pulled out a piece of paper, read her legal rights, and motioned to another agent. Then, right in front of her entire elite social circle, right in front of the wealthy people she had tried so desperately to impress. For years, my daughter-in-law was forced to turn around. The agent grabbed her wrists and pulled them behind her back. The loud metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed through the open door of the shop and reached all the way across the street to where I was sitting. They marched her out of the store and onto the busy Atlanta sidewalk in broad daylight. She was wearing a stunning, expensive designer silk dress, but she looked absolutely pathetic. The women who she thought were her closest friends were standing in the doorway, holding up their cell phones, recording her total disgrace. The illusion of her superiority was completely shattered. The high society princess was nothing but a common white-collar thief being hauled away in the back of a federal vehicle. I watched her tears ruin her expensive makeup, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I remembered the cold rain freezing my skin. I remembered her telling me that I was dead weight. As the federal agent pushed her head down to place her into the back seat of the dark vehicle, Chloe suddenly started screaming. She was not begging for mercy, and she was not asking for her lawyer. She was screaming my son's name. She yelled to anyone who would listen that she knew nothing about the store finances and that her husband Andre had forced her to do it all. She screamed that Andre was the real criminal and that she was just an innocent victim. The loyalty between the two thieves had evaporated the very second the cold steel touched her wrists. The internal fracture had officially begun. My son and his wife were no longer a united front working together to steal my legacy. They were two drowning rats desperately trying to climb on top of each other just to keep their heads above the water. And while Chloe was being driven away to sit in a federal holding cell, Andre was sitting in his office about to find out that his own corporate world had just burned completely to the ground. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. The arrest of my daughter-in-law was a public spectacle that sent shockwaves through their entire elite social circle, but that was only half of the battlefield. While Chloe was sitting in a cold federal holding cell surrounded by concrete walls, my son Andre was sitting in his expensive rented office, about to experience a completely different kind of destruction. The emails I had sent the night before had reached their targets. I had forwarded the undeniable proof of his forged corporate loan documents directly to the 5 biggest financial investors, keeping his technology startup alive. I did not include any threats or demands in those emails. The truth alone was enough to burn his empire to the ground. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Andre's phone began to ring. Dexter and I had tapped into the public business registry records to monitor his company status. Within an hour, 3 of his primary investors officially filed emergency withdrawal notices. They completely pulled their funding and severed all ties with his startup to avoid being implicated in a massive federal bank fraud investigation. His company stock became absolutely worthless in a matter of minutes. The The corporate landlord of his office building issued an immediate eviction notice due to unpaid rent. Andre was left sitting in an empty office staring at a frozen bank account and a mountain of debt that would take him 3 lifetimes to pay off. He had no money to post bail for his wife. He had no money to pay his angry investors. He had no money to hire a defense attorney to save himself from the inevitable federal charges. The carefully constructed illusion of the wealthy, successful businessman had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate boy who had run out of lies to tell. But Roxanne had warned me about this exact moment. She told me that when you strip a predator of its claws and corner it against a wall, it does not surrender. It lashes out with blind, reckless violence. Andre realized that his expensive lawyers and his forged papers could no longer save him. He realized that the only way to stop the financial bleeding and lift the legal freeze on his accounts was to force me to withdraw the injunctions personally. He could not use the law against me anymore, so he decided to use his fists. He remembered the old rundown apartment I owned in South Atlanta. He knew I had nowhere else to go. He decided to pay his old man a visit to beat me into submission and force me to sign away my rights. He thought I was sitting alone in that dusty apartment waiting to be a victim. He had no idea that I had spent my entire life navigating the treacherous roads of this country, anticipating danger before it ever arrived. The day before his financial collapse, Dexter and I had paid a visit to an electronics store on the other side of town. We bought 3 high-definition infrared security cameras. They were small wireless devices designed to blend into the shadows. We went back to my old apartment and spent the evening setting the trap. I mounted one camera in the upper corner of the main living room facing the front door. I hid the second camera on top of the kitchen cabinets, angling it down toward the small dining table. I placed the third camera in the bedroom, giving us a full view of the entire space. We connected all 3 feeds directly to my burner phone. When we were finished, I packed up my few belongings, left the apartment completely empty, and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I was not going to give my son the satisfaction of a physical confrontation. I was not going to let him lay a single hand on me. On the evening his company collapsed, I was sitting in a small 24-hour diner directly across the street from my old apartment building. The diner smelled of stale coffee and fried food. The flickering neon sign outside cast a red glow over my table. I sat in the corner booth holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee, staring down at the glowing screen of my phone. The 3 camera feeds showed my empty, dark apartment in crisp black and white night vision. Dexter sat across from me, quietly eating a plate of eggs and watching the street through the diner window. The sun had completely set and a cold fog was rolling through the neighborhood. At exactly 8 o'clock, a sleek silver luxury car sped around the corner and slammed on its brakes right in front of my apartment building. It was Andre's car. I watched through the diner window as my son stepped out onto the damp pavement. He did not look like the arrogant chief executive officer who had thrown a party to celebrate my eviction. He looked completely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and his tie was pulled loose. He slammed his car door shut and marched toward the entrance of the building, his fists clenched at his sides. I looked down at my phone screen. The trap was officially set. A few minutes later, the audio feed on the living room camera picked up the heavy sound of footsteps stomping up the metal stairs outside my apartment. Then came a violent, aggressive pounding on the wooden door. Andre was not knocking. He was hitting the door with his closed fists, screaming my name. "Open the door, old man," he yelled, his voice distorted by pure, desperate rage. "I know you are in there. Open the door right now and fix this mess before I tear this place apart." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I did not feel fear. I only felt a cold, heavy sorrow. The man standing on the other side of that door was not the little boy I had carried on my shoulders. He was not the son my wife Vivian had loved so deeply. He was a monster created by greed and entitlement. When I did not answer, the pounding stopped for a brief second. Then the camera feed showed the heavy wooden door completely violently shatter. Andre kicked the door directly under the deadbolt, splintering the wood and forcing the frame to crack open. The door swung wildly and hit the interior wall with a massive crash. Andre stormed into the dark apartment, breathing heavily. The infrared camera captured his face perfectly. His eyes were wide and frantic. He looked around the empty living room, searching for me in the shadows. When he realized the room was empty, he let out a loud, guttural scream of absolute frustration. "Where are you?" he roared, kicking a small wooden side table, sending it crashing into the wall and shattering the legs. "You ruined my life. You ruined my company. You are going to pay for this, you miserable old fool." I sat in the diner booth completely silent, watching the glowing screen as my son systematically destroyed my property. He marched into the kitchen, ripping the cabinet doors off their hinges, looking for the black leather ledger that could send him to federal prison. He swept his arm across the kitchen counter, sending an old toaster and a stack of plates crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking ceramic echoed through the audio feed. He moved into the bedroom. The third camera watched him grab the edge of the bare mattress and flip it completely over. He tore the doors off the small closet, throwing old empty cardboard boxes into the hallway. He was behaving like a wild animal trapped in a cage, tearing at the bars. He spent 10 minutes completely destroying the small apartment, searching desperately for anything he could use to save himself. When he finally realized that I was not there and that the ledger was nowhere to be found, he collapsed onto the broken mattress in the dark. He buried his face in his hands, pulling at his hair. The audio feed picked up the sound of his ragged, uneven breathing. He was entirely broken. He had come to beat an old man into submission and found absolutely nothing but empty space and his own miserable reflection. Dexter reached across the diner table and pointed at my phone screen. "We got him," Dexter whispered, his voice thick with grim satisfaction. I nodded slowly and pressed the save button on the recording application. I had just captured 10 minutes of high-definition infrared video complete with crystal-clear audio. The video showed my son kicking down a locked door, destroying private property, and making violent verbal threats against my life. In the state of Georgia, that was not a simple misdemeanor. That was felony breaking and entering combined with terroristic threats and malicious destruction of property. My son thought he was hunting me down to force my hand. He had no idea that he had just willingly walked into a legally binding trap. He had just handed me the absolute power to send him to a state penitentiary for the next 15 years of his life. He was no longer just a white-collar criminal hiding behind forged bank documents. He was a violent felon caught perfectly on tape. I finished my black coffee and placed a $5 bill on the diner table. I looked out the window, watching my son stumble out of the apartment building and get back into his luxury car. He drove away into the cold, foggy night, completely unaware that his life was effectively over. He had thrown away his final chance at redemption. The ledger, the tax evasion, the forged loans, and now the felony break-in. The arsenal was completely full. It was time to stop playing in the shadows and bring the full, crushing weight of the law down upon their heads. It was time for the final performance. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. The morning after the brutal break-in, I sat in the plush leather guest chair of Roxanne's downtown law office. Dexter sat next to me with a deeply triumphant smile on his face. He plugged his portable laptop into the massive flat-screen television mounted on her office wall and pressed play. The high-definition infrared video completely filled the screen. We watched in absolute silence as my son kicked down the door of my old apartment, destroying my furniture and screaming violent threats at the top of his lungs. Roxanne leaned forward, resting her elbows on her polished mahogany desk. A cold, predatory smile spread across her face. She told me this was the absolute end of the line for Andre. She explained that the forged loan documents and the corporate tax evasion were complex white-collar crimes that could take months or even years to fully prosecute through the federal system. But this video was raw, undeniable felony violence. She reached for her heavy office phone and told me she was going to send the digital file directly to the district attorney right now. She guaranteed me that Andre would be arrested before dinner and denied bail because of the clear, terroristic threats against a family member. I reached across the wide desk and gently placed my hand over the phone receiver. I looked her dead in the eye and told her no. Roxanne frowned in deep confusion. She reminded me that this man wanted me dead and that keeping this video hidden was a massive, unnecessary risk. I shook my head slowly. I explained to her that sending my son and his wife to a concrete cell right now was entirely too easy. Prison is a terrible place, but it is also a hiding place. It would allow them to quietly disappear from the world. Their elite friends would whisper about them for a few weeks and then completely forget they ever existed. I did not want them to disappear quietly in the dark. I wanted them to burn in the brightest light possible. I wanted to take away the only thing they valued more than money and freedom. I wanted to take away their pride, their reputation, and their social standing. I told Roxanne to keep the video locked in her secure safe. The trap was not fully sprung yet. My instincts were completely correct. 2 days later, Dexter called me with a major update from his contacts in the high society circles. Chloe's wealthy, elitist parents had quietly posted her massive federal bail. They had hired expensive crisis management consultants to spin the story of the Internal Revenue Service raid. They were telling everyone in their social circle that the raid at the boutique was just a simple clerical error and a massive misunderstanding by the government. But they knew whispers were spreading rapidly. Andre knew his remaining business contacts were terrified of the fraud rumors. So instead of hiding in shame, my son and his wife decided to double down on their absolute arrogance. They announced they were hosting a massive, extravagant charity gala right inside the grand ballroom of my estate. They invited the wealthiest families, the top corporate investors, and the local media to the mansion. They were going to serve expensive champagne, hire classical musicians, and give speeches about philanthropy. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to prove to the entire city of Atlanta that they were completely untouchable and that their financial empire was stronger than ever. They wanted to use my house to rebuild the fake kingdom they were rapidly losing. I smiled when Dexter read me the details of the gala. They had built the perfect stage for their own destruction. They were gathering every single person they wanted to impress into one single room. I told Dexter we were going to that party, but we could not simply walk through the front doors. Andre had hired armed private security to keep out anyone who was not on the verified guest list. I needed a golden ticket. I made a phone call to a man named Marcus. Marcus was an old trucking buddy of mine who now ran a massive international shipping logistics company. He was a multimillionaire who preferred to operate in the shadows using various shell corporations. I explained the entire situation to him. Marcus laughed a deep, booming laugh and told me he would handle everything. An hour later, Marcus used one of his anonymous shell companies to purchase the platinum sponsor table right at the very front of the ballroom. He registered the table under a fake corporate name and listed me and Dexter as the primary corporate representatives. We were officially on the maximum security guest list. I had the ticket to the war, but I could not walk onto the battlefield wearing a faded denim jacket and dirty work boots. If I was going to take back my kingdom, I had to look like the king. Dexter drove me to a private bespoke tailor in the wealthy district of Buckhead. It was a secluded luxury shop I had used 20 years ago when I first started making real money in the logistics business. The old Italian tailor remembered me instantly. He took one look at my worn-out clothes and did not judge me at all. He simply asked me what kind of statement I wanted to make to the world. I told him I was attending a funeral for a very arrogant enemy, and I needed the sharpest armor he had. We spent 3 hours selecting the finest heavy wool fabric in pitch black. He measured every inch of my frame, noting the broad shoulders I had built from decades of heavy labor. He brought out a crisp, brilliant white shirt and a solid black silk tie. For 2 days, his team worked around the clock to hand-stitch the custom suit to my exact proportions. They tailored the waist and the sleeves perfectly, ensuring every single line was flawless. On the evening of the grand gala, I stood in the fitting room of the shop and put on the suit. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The tired, freezing old man who had walked 5 miles in the icy rain was completely gone. The suit fit me like a second skin. It projected absolute power and unyielding authority. I slipped on a pair of polished, black leather dress shoes that shined like dark glass. I adjusted the silver cuffs on my wrists and tied the black silk tie with steady hands. I looked into my own eyes in the mirror and saw the fire burning brightly. My son and his wife thought they had completely erased me from existence. They thought they were going to spend the evening clinking crystal glasses and laughing with the elite society of Atlanta. They had absolutely no idea that the ghost they had tried to bury was about to walk right through their front doors and turn their beautiful dream into an absolute living nightmare. I walked out of the tailor shop and stepped into the back of the sleek black town car Dexter had rented for the night. Dexter was wearing a sharp navy blue suit and holding a thick leather briefcase resting on his lap. Inside that briefcase was every single piece of destructive evidence we had gathered over the last few weeks. We sat in silence as the driver navigated through the busy city streets heading north toward the wealthy suburbs. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I had survived the freezing rain. I had survived the betrayal. I had meticulously gathered my weapons in the dark. I told the driver to take us straight up the main driveway of the estate. It was finally time to go home and collect the ultimate debt. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. The sleek black town car rolled silently through the massive iron gates of the estate in Buckhead. I looked out through the tinted window at the long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. The last time I had traveled down this exact path, I was wearing a thin cotton robe and broken bedroom slippers, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing rain while my son laughed at my misery. Tonight, the winter air was just as cold, but I did not feel a single chill. The custom-tailored pitch-black suit felt like heavy armor against my skin. I sat in the back seat with my hands resting calmly on my knees, while Dexter sat beside me holding the thick leather briefcase containing their absolute destruction. The front lawn of the estate was completely transformed. My son and his wife had spared absolutely no expense in their desperate attempt to save their public image. A dozen valet attendants in crisp red jackets were running back and forth, parking a continuous stream of luxury vehicles. A massive white event tent was attached to the side patio, glowing with warm ambient lighting. I stepped out of the town car and buttoned my suit jacket. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air. I looked at the towering brick facade of the home I had built for my family. It was time to reclaim my territory. Dexter and I walked up the wide stone steps to the heavy oak front doors. 2 large private security guards in dark suits stood on either side of the entrance holding digital tablets. They looked at my sharp black suit and my polished leather shoes with deep respect, having absolutely no idea that I was the man who had been banished from this very property just weeks ago. Dexter simply stepped forward and gave the name of the anonymous shell corporation our friend Marcus had used to purchase the platinum sponsor table. The guard tapped his screen, smiled politely, and opened the heavy doors for us, welcoming us to the grand charity gala. We stepped into the massive foyer. The air inside was thick with the suffocating smell of expensive designer perfumes and roasted meats. The gentle sound of a live classical string quartet drifted through the hallway, mingling with the high-pitched laughter of the Atlanta elite. These were the wealthiest, most powerful people in the city, and they were all drinking champagne paid for with my stolen retirement money. Dexter and I did not walk directly into the main ballroom. We stayed back in the shadows of the grand arched doorway, observing the scene. The ballroom was completely packed. Crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant golden light over dozens of round tables covered in white silk cloths. Waiters in tuxedos moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage wine. It was a beautiful, glittering illusion built entirely on a foundation of lies, fraud, and elder abuse. At the far end of the ballroom stood a large, elevated stage decorated with massive arrangements of white roses. And standing right in the center of that stage, illuminated by a bright spotlight, was my daughter-in-law, Chloe. She was wearing a breathtaking emerald green silk gown that probably cost more than my first delivery truck. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she was holding a silver microphone. She looked absolutely radiant, portraying the perfect image of a successful, generous, high-society wife. You would never look at her and guess that just a few days ago she had been dragged out of her boutique in cold steel handcuffs by federal agents. Standing just off to the side of the stage was my son Andre. He was wearing a sharp tuxedo, but he could not hide the absolute panic bleeding through his eyes. He looked exhausted. His face was pale and he was sweating heavily under the warm lights. He was constantly checking his phone, desperately waiting for a miracle to save his bankrupt technology company. He was a broken man trying to hold up a crumbling wall. I stood perfectly still in the shadows and listened as Chloe's voice echoed through the massive speakers. The sheer hypocrisy of her words made my blood run completely cold. She was actually giving a speech about the supreme importance of family values. She looked out into the crowd of wealthy investors and placed her free hand gracefully over her heart. She spoke softly, holding back fake tears, as she talked about how difficult the past year had been for her and her wonderful husband. She told the crowd that they had faced unexpected malicious attacks from jealous competitors, referring to the Internal Revenue Service raid as a simple corporate misunderstanding. She praised her husband Andre, calling him a brilliant provider and a deeply moral man who always put his family first. Then she had the absolute audacity to talk about sacrifice. She looked directly into the camera of a local news reporter standing near the front row and said that true strength comes from taking care of the vulnerable. She said that family means never turning your back on the people who need you the most. She was speaking those beautiful, heartfelt words in the exact same room where she had handed me 2 trash bags and told me to wander into the freezing night to die. She was standing on the stage I paid for using the electricity I financed to tell the world what a wonderful, generous person she was. I turned my head and looked at Dexter. He gave me a slow, firm nod. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. I stepped forward out of the dark hallway and placed both of my hands flat against the heavy wooden double doors leading directly into the center of the ballroom. I pushed them open with all the strength in my shoulders. The heavy oak doors swung inward and slammed against the interior walls with a massive, echoing thud that sounded like a gunshot. The loud noise ripped through the elegant atmosphere. The classical string quartet sitting near the entrance jumped in surprise and completely stopped playing their instruments. The sudden silence that fell over the massive ballroom was heavy and absolute. Every single head in the room turned toward the back entrance. Hundreds of eyes stared at me. I did not hesitate. I stepped directly into the warm, golden light of the chandeliers. I kept my head held high, my shoulders pulled back, and my face completely devoid of any emotion. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom, my polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. The crowd of wealthy elites naturally parted down the middle to make way for me. I heard them whispering to each other, murmuring in confusion. They saw a tall, powerful black man in a flawless custom suit, walking with the absolute authority of a king reclaiming his throne. They did not recognize the broken old man in the faded denim jacket, but Chloe recognized me. I kept my eyes locked entirely on her face as I walked toward the stage. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her jaw dropped open, and the silver microphone slipped slightly in her trembling hand. A loud screech of electronic feedback blasted through the speakers, causing the guests in the front row to cover their ears. Chloe's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of chalk white. She looked as if she were staring at a ghost rising from the grave. Andre followed his wife's terrified gaze. When he saw me walking down the aisle, his entire body went rigid. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a tall table of champagne glasses and sending them crashing to the floor. He knew I was not supposed to be there. He knew he had a signed court order legally banning me from coming within 500 feet of the property. He thought the law was protecting him. The shock only lasted for a few seconds before Chloe's survival instinct kicked in. Her face twisted from terror into pure vicious rage. She realized that the elite society of Atlanta was watching her perfect illusion crumble. She gripped the microphone tightly and pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Security!" she screamed, her voice cracking with sheer panic and fury. "Security, get in here right now! Grab that man! That is a crazy, violent old man who is trespassing on private property. Throw him out into the street immediately!" At her command, the illusion of the sophisticated gala completely shattered. Women gasped and pulled their husbands back. 4 massive private security guards wearing dark suits and earpieces immediately rushed forward from the corners of the ballroom. They converged on me quickly, their faces completely serious, preparing to tackle me to the marble floor and drag me out by force. I did not stop walking. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not break my eye contact with my trembling son. I simply stood my ground in the center of the room, waiting for the final piece of the trap to snap shut. The 2 largest security guards reached out their heavy hands to grab my shoulders, but before their fingers could even brush the fabric of my custom suit, a deep, booming voice thundered from the open doorway behind me. "Take one more step toward that man, and I will arrest every single one of you for assault." The private security guards froze instantly, their hands hovering in the air. The authority in that voice was undeniable. They slowly backed away, raising their hands in surrender. I did not have to turn around to know who had just walked into the room. I heard the heavy, familiar sound of tactical boots stepping onto the marble floor. Through the open double doors walked the city sheriff of Atlanta, accompanied by 6 heavily armed, uniformed deputies. The sheriff was a tall, broad-shouldered man with gray hair and a shining gold star pinned to his chest. He was also a man I had known for over 30 years. We had served on the same community boards, and I had quietly supported his campaigns long before my son ever had a penny to his name. The sheriff walked straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring the gasps of the wealthy crowd. He stopped right beside me. He placed a respectful hand on my shoulder and gave me a firm nod. Then he looked up at the stage where my son and my daughter-in-law were standing frozen in absolute horror. The sheriff reached into his heavy uniform jacket and pulled out a thick stack of official court documents bearing the bright red seal of a federal judge. He held the papers up high so every single person in the room could see them clearly. Andre and Chloe, the sheriff, announced, his voice echoing loudly through the silent ballroom. By order of the federal court and the Internal Revenue Service, I am hereby executing a total asset forfeiture warrant on this property and all contents within it. Furthermore, I am executing an immediate emergency eviction notice. This house does not belong to you. Your party is officially over. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son, sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. The sheriff's words hung in the air, and the massive ballroom grew so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. Asset forfeiture. Emergency eviction. The words bounced off the crystal chandeliers and sank deep into the minds of the wealthy guests. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The classical musicians had completely packed away their instruments and were quietly slipping out the side doors. I watched my son Andre step forward to the very edge of the stage. His face was pale and covered in a cold sweat. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive tuxedo. He looked down at the sheriff and tried to project the authority of a wealthy homeowner, but his entire body was shaking. "This is a massive mistake," he yelled, pointing a trembling finger down at the sheriff and then pointing directly at me. "That man is a crazy old fool who has lost his mind. He does not own this house. He has a legally binding restraining order against him. He is not allowed to be within 500 feet of this property. You need to arrest him right now for trespassing. Arrest him and get him out of my house before I call the mayor." The sheriff did not even blink. He looked at Andre with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He slowly shook his head and tapped the thick stack of federal warrants in his hand. "You do not have a house, son," the sheriff replied, his voice calm and deadly. "You have a forged piece of paper that is currently the center of a federal fraud investigation, and that restraining order you filed is completely null and void because it was obtained under the penalty of perjury. Now step back and keep your hands where my deputies can see them." I did not wait for my son to process his legal defeat. I walked slowly up the short wooden stairs leading to the stage. My custom black suit moved perfectly with every step. Chloe saw me coming and backed away completely terrified. She stumbled in her expensive emerald green dress, almost tripping over her high heels. I reached out and took the silver microphone right out of her trembling hand. She did not resist. She just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. I turned around to face the massive crowd of investors, socialites, and media reporters. The ballroom was so incredibly quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. I brought the microphone to my mouth. I did not yell. I did not scream or curse or show them a single ounce of the anger that had been burning inside me for weeks. I spoke with a cold, steady voice that carried the absolute weight of 40 years of hard labor and undeniable truth. "I apologize for the sudden interruption to your beautiful evening," I said, looking out over the sea of wealthy faces. "I know you are all enjoying the food and the champagne that my retirement fund paid for. I did not come here to ruin the party or cause a scene. I simply came to collect my keys. As soon as the words left my mouth, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the ballroom opened once again. Roxanne walked in wearing her razor-sharp charcoal suit. She carried the thick leather briefcase Dexter had brought in the town car. She walked down the center aisle with the terrifying grace of a corporate executioner. She did not walk toward the stage. She stopped right in front of the platinum sponsor tables where all of Andre's biggest remaining investors and Chloe's wealthiest family members were sitting. Roxanne popped the golden latches of the briefcase. She pulled out thick stacks of crisp white paper. Without saying a single word, she began handing the documents out to the people sitting in the front row. She handed the investors the corporate loan documents, clearly showing the massive multi-million-dollar fraud and my perfectly forged signature. She handed the wealthy socialites the official Internal Revenue Service reports detailing Chloe's massive tax evasion and hidden offshore accounts. And finally, she handed them the true certified property deed proving that the mansion belonged to an irrevocable blind trust completely controlled by me. I stood perfectly still on the stage and watched the absolute destruction of their fake empire unfold in real time. The wealthy investors read the papers and the color completely drained from their faces. One older man in a gray suit stood up, threw the forged loan document onto the table, and cursed loudly. The men who had trusted Andre with their money realized they had been lied to and defrauded by a desperate criminal. The women who had admired Chloe read the tax evasion reports and realized she was a federal thief who had stolen from her own family to buy their friendship. The whispers started immediately. The whispers grew into a loud, chaotic murmur of absolute outrage and deep disgust. Chloe's mother, the same arrogant woman who had mistaken me for a gardener and handed me a $10 bill to take out my own trash, was sitting at the very front table. She picked up the federal tax evasion report and the forged property deed. She read the bold print confirming her daughter's felony crimes. Then she slowly looked up at me standing on the stage in my custom black suit holding the microphone with absolute authority. She finally realized exactly who I was. The sheer humiliation, the shock, and the undeniable truth were too much for her fragile pride to handle. She gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed backward in her chair, fainting completely dead away on the marble floor. That was the breaking point. The elite guests realized they were standing in the exact center of a massive federal crime scene. No wealthy person in Atlanta wanted to be associated with tax evasion and corporate fraud. The socialites and powerful investors dropped their crystal champagne glasses on the tables, grabbed their expensive coats, and rushed toward the exits. It was a complete chaotic stampede of designer suits and expensive gowns fleeing the sinking ship. Chloe ran to the edge of the stage, crying real tears, begging her friends to stay, pleading with them to listen to her side of the story. But nobody even looked at her. They pushed past each other, desperate to get out of the house. Within 2 minutes, the beautiful, sparkling charity gala turned into an absolute ghost town, leaving nothing behind but spilled wine and abandoned plates of expensive food. Andre stood on the stage watching his entire fake world crumble into dust before his very eyes. His investors were gone forever. His wife's reputation was destroyed permanently. His home was currently being seized by the federal government. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The sheer panic and terror in his eyes were completely gone. They were replaced by a dark, blinding, animalistic rage. He blamed me for everything. He blamed the man who had given him the world for taking it back when he decided to bite the hand that fed him. With a loud guttural roar, Andre lunged at me. He threw his entire body weight forward, his fists raised, aiming right for my face. He wanted to destroy me just like he had destroyed my old apartment. But I did not even flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I knew I did not have to lift a finger. Before he could even cross the 5 feet of space between us, 3 massive city deputies rushed onto the stage. They moved with incredible speed. They tackled my son from the side, hitting him with the crushing force of a freight train. They slammed him hard against the polished wooden floor of the stage. The heavy thud shook the massive arrangements of white roses right off their display stands, sending petals flying into the air. The deputies pinned his arms behind his back, pressing his face aggressively into the hard floorboards. I heard the sharp sound of his expensive tuxedo jacket tearing at the shoulder. Andre struggled wildly, kicking his legs and screaming at the top of his lungs, but he was completely helpless against the physical weight of the law. One of the deputies pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and locked them tightly around Andre's wrists. The metallic clicks echoed loudly through the empty ballroom. I stood over him, looking down at the pathetic, desperate man he had chosen to become. The silver microphone was still in my hand. The ballroom was completely empty except for the police, the lawyer, the weeping daughter-in-law, and the broken son who thought he could steal a king's throne. The truth had finally spoken loud and clear, and it left them with absolutely nothing but the cold, hard floor. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son, sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. The massive grand ballroom was completely silent. The classical music was gone. The wealthy investors and the elite socialites had vanished into the night like smoke, leaving behind nothing but the physical wreckage of a fake empire. Crystal champagne glasses lay shattered across the polished marble floor. Expensive plates of caviar and roasted meats sat abandoned on the white silk tablecloths. The beautiful arrangements of white roses had been knocked over during the brief violent struggle, leaving bruised petals scattered across the wooden stage. It looked exactly like the aftermath of a terrible storm. In the center of the stage, my son Andre was breathing heavily. 2 large city deputies pulled him up from the floor by his arms. His expensive custom tuxedo jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his crisp white shirt was wrinkled and covered in dust. His hands were securely locked behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, completely broken and humiliated. All the arrogant fire had completely left his body. He finally understood that he was no longer the brilliant chief executive officer of a technology startup. He was just a common criminal caught in a trap he had built with his own 2 hands. Chloe stood a few feet away, trembling uncontrollably in her emerald green silk designer dress. Her perfect makeup was completely ruined by dark streams of black mascara running down her pale cheeks. She looked around the empty ballroom, searching desperately for a friendly face to save her, but there was absolutely no one left. Her wealthy mother had fainted and been carried out by her father. Her elite friends had abandoned her the second the word federal was spoken. The city sheriff stepped forward and addressed them both, his deep voice echoing in the large empty room. He informed them that the entire property was officially under federal lockdown. The estate, the vehicles, the bank accounts, and every single physical item inside the house were now classified as active evidence in a massive financial fraud and tax evasion investigation. Chloe gasped and took a step toward the stairs leading up to the master bedroom. She told the sheriff that she needed to go upstairs to pack her suitcases. She said she needed her heavy winter coats, her designer purses, and her expensive jewelry before they left the property. One of the deputies immediately stepped directly in her path, blocking the staircase. The sheriff shook his head slowly. He told her she was not allowed to take a single item from the house. He explained that since she had used stolen retirement funds and hidden corporate money to purchase her luxury items, everything she owned was subject to federal asset forfeiture. The only things they were legally allowed to keep were the clothes currently on their backs. The reality of those words hit Chloe like a physical punch to the stomach. She looked down at her thin silk evening gown and her delicate high heels. It was the middle of winter in Atlanta, and the temperature outside was dropping near freezing. They had absolutely no coats, no money, no credit cards, and nowhere to go. They were being cast out into the exact same freezing night they had forced me into just a few weeks ago. Desperation completely shattered her pride. Chloe turned away from the sheriff and looked directly at me. The woman who had shoved 2 plastic trash bags into my chest and told me I was dead weight was now falling to her knees on the marble floor. She clasped her hands together and began to sob loudly. She begged me to tell the sheriff to let them stay for just one more night. She pleaded with me, calling me a good man and a loving father. She promised me that they would pay back every single penny they had stolen. She swore that it was all a terrible misunderstanding and that families should always forgive each other. I stood on the stage in my flawless black suit and looked down at her. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Pity is reserved for people who make honest mistakes. What they had done was a calculated, cold-blooded execution. I remembered the long 5-mile walk in the icy rain. I remembered my broken bedroom slippers scraping against the wet concrete. I remembered the terrible crushing pain in my chest when I stood at the pharmacy counter and learned that my son had canceled my heart medication to speed up my death. I did not answer her. I simply looked away. My silence was heavier and more absolute than any curse word or angry shout. The sheriff nodded to his deputies. They grabbed Andre by the arms and began marching him down the center aisle of the ballroom. Another deputy took Chloe by the elbow and pulled her up from the floor, forcing her to walk. They paraded them through the beautiful foyer and pushed the heavy oak front doors open. I followed slowly behind them, walking out onto the wide front porch. The night air was incredibly cold and crisp. The dozens of valet attendants and luxury cars were completely gone. The long, winding brick driveway was empty except for the dark patrol vehicles flashing their red and blue lights. I stood on the top step of the porch and watched my son and his wife walk down the driveway. The freezing winter wind whipped violently against them. Andre shivered uncontrollably in his torn tuxedo. Chloe crossed her bare arms over her chest, trying desperately to preserve her body heat in her thin silk dress. Her high heels clicked unevenly against the cold, hard pavement. They looked incredibly small and pathetic, disappearing into the dark shadows of the ancient oak trees. I looked up at the brick wall near the entrance. The massive white banner they had hung for their cruel party was still tied to the stone pillars. The wind caught the thick fabric, making it flap loudly in the quiet night. "Goodbye, freeloader. Do not come back." The words were still printed in bold black letters for the entire world to see. It was the perfect monument to their absolute arrogance. I reached into the inner pocket of my custom suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the photo gallery and found the picture I had taken 2 weeks ago. I looked at the bright digital image of Chloe, smiling cruelly, and Andre hiding in the background, surrounded by expensive champagne and wealthy friends. Then I looked out at the dark, empty driveway where those same 2 people were now wandering aimlessly into the freezing night with absolutely nothing to their names. The circle was completely closed. The debt was paid in full. I pressed the power button on my phone, placed it back into my pocket, and turned around. I walked back into the warm, glowing foyer of my home and pulled the heavy oak doors shut, locking the cold world outside. But out on the dark city street, the nightmare for my son and his wife was just beginning. When the deputies finally unfastened Andre's handcuffs and left them standing on the icy curb outside the neighborhood gates, the true gravity of their situation settled in. Chloe was freezing and hysterical. She borrowed a cell phone from a passing stranger and dialed the private home number of her wealthy parents. She expected her mother and father to send a warm, luxury vehicle to rescue them and take them to their massive estate. Her father answered the phone. He did not sound loving or concerned. He sounded completely terrified and furious. He told his daughter that federal agents had already visited his home asking questions about her hidden boutique accounts. He told her that associating with a known corporate fraudster and tax evader would destroy his own business and ruin their family reputation in Atlanta forever. Before Chloe could even finish crying and begging for a warm bed, her own father told her to never call that number again. Then he hung up the phone, leaving the line completely dead. She dropped the borrowed phone onto the cold pavement and collapsed onto the curb, pulling her knees to her chest. Andre stood beside her, staring blankly at the passing cars. His brilliant tech company was dead. His bank accounts were seized. His wife was a federal criminal. And her wealthy family had just completely disowned them to save themselves. They had no coats, no food, no cash, and no allies. The predators had officially become the prey. The long, dark punishment of the streets was waiting to teach them the exact same lesson they had tried to teach me. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. 2 full weeks passed since the night the massive oak doors of the estate closed, shutting my son and his wife out into the freezing winter. The federal authorities had completely locked down the property, taking inventory of every stolen dollar and every piece of fraudulent paperwork. I did not go back to my old rundown apartment in South Atlanta. I used the remaining clean funds from my logistics company to rent a quiet, comfortable suite on the top floor of a secure downtown hotel. It was a beautiful room with thick carpets, a large, heavy bed, and massive windows looking out over the city skyline. I spent my days reading the newspaper, drinking hot tea, and watching the winter weather freeze the streets below. I was safe. I was warm. I was completely at peace. For the first 3 days, my secure phone was completely silent. I knew exactly what they were doing out there in the cold. They were running entirely on blind panic and lingering arrogance. They were walking the streets trying to contact their wealthy friends, begging for a guest room or a small loan. They were calling expensive defense attorneys who laughed and hung up the phone the second they realized my son had absolutely no money and his assets were frozen by the federal government. They thought they could survive the fallout without ever having to lower their heads and come crawling back to the old man they had tried to destroy. But the streets of Atlanta in the dead of winter do not care about your past titles or your designer clothes. The streets only take. By the 5th day, the freezing reality of their situation completely broke them. The battery on my new phone began to drain from the sheer volume of incoming calls. The phone buzzed and vibrated relentlessly on the polished wooden desk of my hotel room. I never answered a single call. I simply let the automated system route every desperate attempt directly to voicemail. 1 message quickly became 5. 5 messages turned into 20. By the end of the first week, there were over 50 recorded messages sitting in the digital inbox waiting to be heard. On the morning of the 14th day, I woke up early. I ordered a large pot of black coffee from room service. I sat in the plush leather armchair by the window, poured myself a steaming cup, and finally pressed the button to play the messages. The voice that came through the small speaker did not sound like the brilliant, confident tech executive who had forged my signature. It sounded like a terrified, lost child. It was my son, Andre. His voice was raw and hoarse, shaking violently from the freezing cold. He was sobbing uncontrollably. He said, "Dad, please answer the phone. I am begging you. We are sleeping in the back seat of my car parked under the highway overpass. The engine ran out of gas 2 days ago and we have no way to turn on the heater. My hands are turning blue, Dad. Please, I am so sorry for everything. Just let us come inside." I listened to the sound of heavy traffic roaring in the background of his message. I heard his teeth chattering against the receiver. I took a slow sip of my hot, bitter coffee. The next message began to play. This time it was Chloe. The elegant, high-society woman who had slapped my chest with garbage bags and called me a freeloader was completely unrecognizable. Her voice was weak and pathetic, broken by heavy, uncontrollable crying. She said she had not eaten a warm meal in 4 days. She said her designer shoes were ruined and her feet were bleeding from walking miles in the freezing sleet. She said her own father had threatened to call the police if she ever showed up at their house again. She begged me for forgiveness, swearing she would do whatever I wanted if I just gave them a few dollars for a warm motel room. Message after message played, filling the warm, quiet hotel room with the sounds of their absolute misery and desperation. They cried, they pleaded, they bargained, and they whimpered like beaten dogs left out in the rain. I sat perfectly still, looking at my own reflection in the cold glass of the window. A weaker man might have felt a terrible ache in his heart. A weaker man might have remembered the boy he raised and rushed out into the city to save him from his own consequences. But I felt absolutely nothing. My face was a mask of solid stone. I knew the truth. They were not crying because they suddenly realized the deep moral evil of what they had done to me. They were not crying because they loved me or respected me. They were only crying because they had lost the game. They were crying because the concrete was hard and the wind was cold, and they were finally facing the exact same brutal reality they had designed for me. I let the voicemails play until the very last one finished. Then I set my ceramic coffee mug down on the table. They had been cooked long enough. The cold had seeped deep enough into their bones to ensure they would never, ever forget this physical lesson for the rest of their natural lives. It was finally time to put an end to the whimpering and collect the ultimate signature. I picked up my phone and opened the text messaging application. I typed a single short message and sent it directly to Andre's dead phone, knowing he would eventually find a place to charge it. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp, Roxanne's law office. If you are 1 minute late, the door locks and you stay on the street forever. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son, sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them, without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. At exactly 7:45 in the morning, I sat in the grand conference room of Roxanne's downtown law office. The room was a fortress of polished mahogany and thick soundproof glass overlooking the waking city of Atlanta. The sky outside was a pale, freezing gray, but inside the room the air was warm and smelled of expensive coffee and leather. I wore the same custom black suit I had worn to the gala. It was my armor for the final battle. Roxanne sat at the head of the long table, organizing a stack of legal documents with absolute precision. Dexter stood silently by the heavy wooden door, his arms crossed over his chest, acting as the final barrier between my past and my future. We did not speak. There was no need for words. The trap was set, and the prey was walking willingly into the steel jaws. At precisely 8 o'clock, the receptionist buzzed the intercom to announce their arrival. Dexter pulled the heavy door open, and my son walked into the room, followed closely by his wife. The sight of them was a stark, brutal testament to the unforgiving nature of the streets. They had spent 14 days living like stray animals, and their bodies carried the heavy toll of every single freezing night. Andre had lost a significant amount of weight. His face was hollow and covered in a thick layer of dark dirt and patchy facial hair. He was wearing the same torn tuxedo trousers from the night of the gala, but the expensive jacket was gone, replaced by a stained, oversized wool coat he had likely pulled from a charity donation bin. His hands were raw and blistered. Chloe walked in behind him, and the transformation was even more severe. The arrogant high society woman who had laughed at my worn-out clothes was completely erased. Her hair was matted and greasy, hanging in limp strands around her pale face. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the winter wind. She smelled heavily of stale sweat, wet pavement, and absolute desperation. She kept her eyes glued to the expensive carpet, too ashamed to even look at the polished mahogany table. They stood near the doorway, shivering uncontrollably in the warm office, looking like two ghosts who had forgotten how to live. Roxanne gestured to the two empty leather chairs across the table. They slowly walked over and sat down, moving with the stiff, aching caution of the elderly. I sat directly across from them, resting my hands flat on the cool wood. I looked into my son's eyes. I saw the desperate, pathetic hope swimming in his dark pupils. He believed this was a rescue mission. He truly believed that after 2 weeks of punishment, his father had finally softened. He thought the old man was going to give a stern lecture, shed a few tears of forgiveness, and then slide a warm check across the table to help them secure a luxury apartment and start over. Andre leaned forward and rested his dirty hands on the table. He began to speak, and his voice was a broken, raspy whisper. He told me that he was deeply sorry for everything he had done. He said the streets had taught him a terrible lesson, and that he had never known such agonizing pain. He wept openly, letting the tears cut clean lines through the dirt on his face. Chloe joined in, softly sobbing into her hands. She whispered that she was ready to be a real family again, and that she would never take anything for granted. They performed their apologies with the practiced desperation of starving beggars. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the unconditional love of a father to override the cold logic of a betrayed man. I let them cry for 5 full minutes. I listened to their apologies, and I felt absolutely nothing. The father who would have moved mountains to save them had died the night they disabled my truck and forced me to walk 5 miles in the freezing rain. When they finally fell silent, waiting for my response, I did not offer them a single word of comfort. I did not reach for my checkbook. Instead, I reached out and touched the thick white document resting on the table in front of me. I slid it slowly across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped directly between Andre and Chloe. They looked down at the paper in confusion. There was no monetary figure printed on the page. There was only dense legal text and a series of blank signature lines at the bottom. Roxanne stood up from her chair and began to speak with the cold, mechanical precision of a seasoned prosecutor. She informed them that they were not there to receive a financial bailout. She told them they were there to decide how they wanted to spend the next 15 years of their lives. She explained that the document on the table was an ironclad confession and an absolute surrender of all human and legal rights regarding my life. Roxanne laid out the terms perfectly clearly. The document contained a fully detailed admission of guilt for the forgery of the corporate loan, the embezzlement of my retirement funds, the federal tax evasion, and the felony breaking and entering of my Southside apartment. By signing the paper, they were legally admitting to every single crime they had committed. Furthermore, the document contained a binding clause of disownment. They would legally surrender any and all future claims to my estate, my blind trust, and my physical assets. They would accept a permanent lifetime restraining order forbidding them from ever contacting me, approaching me, or attempting to profit from my name. They would walk out of the office with absolutely nothing but the dirty clothes on their backs. Andre stared at the document, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. He asked Roxanne what he would possibly gain by signing a confession that destroyed his entire life. Roxanne smiled a very cold smile. She pointed to the heavy steel safe sitting in the corner of her office. She told him that if they signed the document right now, Bernard would instruct her to place the original financial ledger, the forged loan documents, and the infrared security footage of the apartment break-in directly into that safe. The evidence would remain locked away forever. The federal authorities would eventually drop the corporate fraud charges for lack of primary evidence, and the bank would simply write off the frozen corporate accounts as a massive, unrecoverable loss. They would be completely bankrupt and permanently homeless, but they would remain free. Roxanne then pointed to the phone sitting on her desk. She told them that if they refused to sign the document, she would pick up the receiver and call the district attorney who was waiting on standby. She would hand over the high-definition video of Andre kicking down the door and screaming terroristic threats. She would hand over the ledger proving the forgery. She guaranteed them that the police would walk into the conference room within 10 minutes, place them both in handcuffs, and send them to a federal penitentiary for a minimum of 15 years. The reality of the choice crashed down upon them like a collapsing building. Sign away their entire existence and live as penniless beggars on the street, or refuse and spend the next 15 years locked inside a concrete cell. Chloe completely lost her mind. She jumped up from her leather chair, screaming that it was completely unfair. She slammed her raw hands against the mahogany table, leaving dirty smudges on the polished wood. She demanded money. She screamed that I owed them a second chance and that she would absolutely never sign a document that forced her to live like an animal. She turned to Andre, shaking his shoulder violently, demanding that he stand up and fight back against this insane cruelty. But Andre did not stand up. He did not scream or fight. He remained seated, staring blankly at the thick white document sitting in front of him. He looked up from the paper and met my eyes. He saw the absolute unyielding stone in my expression, the complete absence of mercy. In that single quiet moment, the total weight of his defeat finally washed over him. He realized that his father had meticulously engineered a flawless scenario where he possessed absolutely zero leverage. He had no lawyers, no money, no allies, and no escape route. The trap had closed perfectly around his neck, and every single move he had made over the last month had only pulled the noose tighter. He was completely at my mercy, and he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mercy was entirely gone. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. The silence inside the grand mahogany conference room was so incredibly thick, it felt like it was crushing the air right out of my son's lungs. Andre sat frozen in his leather chair, staring down at the thick white document sitting on the polished table. The realization that he had absolutely zero leverage finally broke his spirit. He knew that I was not bluffing. He knew that the heavy steel safe in the corner of the room held the undeniable proof of his felony crimes. He knew that if he did not sign away his entire existence, he would be wearing a bright orange jumpsuit and sitting in a federal prison cell before the sun went down. But before Andre could even reach his trembling hand toward the heavy silver pen resting on the table, his wife completely snapped. The pressure of the streets and the terrifying threat of a 15-year prison sentence finally shattered the fragile alliance between the two thieves. Chloe did not reach for the pen. She reached across the wide table and shoved Andre violently in the chest. She began to scream at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the professional setting of the expensive law office. She pointed a dirty, blistered finger directly in his face and told everyone in the room that this entire disaster was completely his fault. The sheer speed of her betrayal was absolutely staggering. She was willing to throw the man she had married directly under the wheels of a federal prison bus just to save her own skin. She claimed that she was completely innocent and that she had absolutely no idea my retirement funds were being stolen. She looked at Roxanne with wide, desperate eyes and lied through her teeth, saying she was just a loyal, supportive wife who trusted her husband to handle their financial affairs. Chloe yelled that Andre was a massive failure who had manipulated her and dragged her down into the dirt. She blamed him for the forged property deeds and the fake corporate loans. She even had the absolute audacity to claim that Andre was the one who had forced her to call the Adult Protective Services and file the fake dementia report against me. She begged the lawyer to let her walk out the door, claiming she was a victim of his psychological abuse. She was stripping away every single vow she had ever made to him, hoping that throwing him to the wolves would buy her a second chance at a wealthy life. Andre looked at his wife with pure shock that quickly melted into venomous, burning hatred. The man who had sacrificed his own father to please his wife finally realized that she was nothing but a parasite. He slammed his raw hands against the mahogany table and screamed right back at her. He stripped away every single lie she had just told. He exposed her failing luxury boutique and her massive secret debts to the entire room. He told us that she was a greedy, shallow gold digger who had threatened to divorce him and take half his company if he did not find a way to maintain her wealthy lifestyle. He yelled that she was the one who suggested draining my retirement accounts to buy her designer dresses. He told the room that it was her idea to throw the cruel party and humiliate me in front of her elite friends. He pointed his finger at her face and revealed that she was the one who had secretly paid the mechanic to remove the spark plugs from my truck on that freezing night, hoping the winter air would trigger my heart condition and kill me before morning. They stood in the center of the beautiful, warm office and tore each other apart like starving wild animals, fighting over a scrap of rotten meat. Their marriage, which had been built entirely on a foundation of stolen money and shared arrogance, was dissolving into a toxic puddle of pure hatred and self-preservation. I sat perfectly still in my custom black suit and watched them destroy each other. I did not interrupt their vicious screaming match. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness for their broken marriage. I felt totally detached, like a judge watching two guilty criminals confess their sins to the court. I watched the ugly truth spill out of their mouths, and I realized that the cancer that had infected my family was finally being cut out and exposed to the light. Dexter stood silently by the heavy wooden door, watching the pathetic display with a look of deep disgust on his face. Roxanne sat at the head of the table, her face completely devoid of any emotion. She had seen greedy people turn on each other 1,000 times before. She let them scream and shift the blame for 10 full minutes, letting them exhaust whatever remaining energy they had left in their broken bodies. When their voices finally began to crack and turn into pathetic, ragged sobs, Roxanne slowly raised her wrist. She tapped the glass face of her expensive silver watch with her perfectly manicured fingernail. She did not raise her voice to speak over them. She simply stated with cold mechanical precision that they had exactly 60 seconds left before she picked up her office phone and dialed the direct number for the district attorney. The immediate threat of federal prison instantly silenced their screaming match. The heavy reality of the room crashed back down upon their shoulders. They realized that it did not matter who was more guilty or whose idea it was to steal the money. They were both caught on tape. They were both holding the smoking gun. And the federal government does not care about marital disputes. Andre swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He looked at the heavy silver pen resting next to the thick white document. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely lift his arm from the table. He slowly reached out and picked up the pen. The silver barrel slipped in his sweaty, dirty fingers. He hovered the tip of the pen over the signature line. He looked across the table at me one final time, searching desperately for a single shred of mercy in my eyes. He found absolutely nothing but the cold, hard reflection of his own failure. He pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the metal tip against the thick paper echoed loudly in the quiet room. He signed his full name, signing away his entire inheritance, his legal rights, and his future. He legally admitted to every single felony crime he had committed against me and accepted a permanent lifetime restraining order banning him from ever coming near my properties or my person. When he finished the signature, his hand dropped heavily to his side and he slumped back in his leather chair, completely defeated. Chloe looked at the signed paper and began to weep uncontrollably. The tears fell from her face and left dark, dirty spots on the pristine white document. She reached out and took the silver pen from her husband. She hesitated for a long moment, wiping her running nose with the back of her stained wool sleeve. She looked at the blank line, waiting for her name. She knew that signing the paper meant she would walk out of the building with absolutely nothing but the ruined dress on her back. But she also knew she would not survive a single day inside a women's penitentiary. With a trembling hand, she signed her name right next to his, completing the absolute surrender. Roxanne reached across the table and pulled the thick document toward her. She inspected the signatures carefully, making sure every single line was properly filled out and legally binding. She nodded to me, confirming that the trap was successfully closed. I reached out and took the paper from her hands. I folded the document perfectly in half and slipped it securely into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and slowly pushed myself up from my chair. I buttoned my suit jacket with steady, calm hands. I looked down at the two miserable, broken people sitting in front of me. They were completely covered in the dirt and the stench of the streets. I told them that my late wife Vivian had made a terrible mistake. I told them she had spent her entire life shielding them from the harsh, brutal consequences of the real world because she loved them too much. I kept my voice low and steady. I told them that I would not make that same mistake. I told them that blindly giving them everything had only turned them into monsters. I said, "Welcome to reality." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy wooden door. Dexter pulled it open for me and gave me a firm nod of absolute respect. I walked out into the carpeted hallway, leaving my son and his wife sitting in the conference room with nothing left to say and nothing left to steal. They were escorted out of the building by the security guards 10 minutes later. They walked out of the polished glass doors of the high-rise and stepped back onto the freezing concrete sidewalks of Atlanta. They had absolutely no money, no coats, no home, and no family. The marriage that had been fueled by greed and arrogance had completely shattered in that boardroom. They walked in opposite directions without saying a single word to each other. By 3 o'clock that very same afternoon, Chloe used the last favor she had in the world to secure a cheap pro bono street lawyer. She found Andre sitting on a public bench near the bus station, shivering in his oversized coat. She did not say a word to him. She simply threw a crumpled stack of legal papers directly into his lap and walked away. She officially served him with divorce papers, completely abandoning the sinking ship she had helped destroy. The losers had finally signed their names, and the long, cold punishment of their new lives had officially begun. My own flesh and blood threw a party to celebrate kicking me out into the freezing street. They hung a banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," and laughed while drinking champagne in the house I bought with 40 years of my own sweat and blood. I did not yell. I did not fight back. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces, picked up the garbage bags holding my clothes, and walked out the door. 2 weeks later, my phone was flooded with voice messages from my son, sobbing, begging me to answer, pleading for a second chance because they were sleeping under a highway overpass. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them without breaking a single law, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a mistake that should come with a heavy price. 2 days after the signatures dried on the confession documents, the federal government officially released the physical property back into my control. The financial investigation into the stolen corporate funds was still ongoing, but the house itself belonged entirely to the irrevocable blind trust. Roxanne handed me the heavy brass keys across her mahogany desk. She offered to hire a professional cleaning crew to scrub the estate from top to bottom before I moved back in, but I told her no. I needed to see the house exactly as they had left it. I needed to walk through the ruins of their arrogance one last time. Dexter drove me up the long, winding driveway in his dark sedan. The weather had finally begun to warm up slightly, melting the gray winter slush into clear water that ran down the stone gutters. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the massive brick facade of the mansion. It was a beautiful, impressive structure standing tall among the ancient oak trees. It was the exact kind of home I used to dream about when I was sleeping in the cramped cabin of my delivery truck 40 years ago. I thought that building a castle would keep my family safe from the cruel world. I never imagined that the castle itself would turn my family into monsters. I walked up the wide stone steps and slid the heavy brass key into the lock. The front doors pushed open with a quiet creak. The air inside the foyer was incredibly stale and completely silent. The expensive designer vanilla candles had burned out long ago, leaving behind a faint, sickly sweet smell. I walked slowly through the massive, grand ballroom, where just a few weeks ago my daughter-in-law had stood on a stage wearing an emerald green dress and telling lies to a crowd of wealthy elites. The stage was still there, covered in wilted brown rose petals and shattered champagne glasses. The massive white banner that read, "Goodbye, freeloader," had been torn down by the federal agents and tossed carelessly into the corner of the room. I walked past the ballroom and moved through the massive chef kitchen. The marble countertops were perfectly polished, but the room felt completely dead. I walked up the wide oak staircase, running my hand along the smooth wooden railing. I stepped into the master bedroom. Chloe had filled the room with expensive modern furniture, cold metal statues, and white silk curtains. She had tried so hard to make the room look like a picture in a luxury magazine, but she had stripped away every single ounce of warmth and humanity in the process. I stood in the center of the massive room and listened to the silence. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, hollow silence of a tomb. The house was simply too big, it was too cold, and it held way too many ghosts. I closed my eyes and tried to picture my late wife Vivian walking through the hallways, but her spirit was completely gone from this place. This mansion was no longer a home. It was a physical monument to greed, betrayal, and shallow pride. I realized in that quiet moment that I could never sleep in this house again. I could never sit in the living room without remembering the cruel laughter of the people who threw me away like garbage. I did not want the marble floors or the crystal chandeliers. I had spent my entire life working to accumulate wealth, thinking it was the ultimate measure of a man. But the wealth had poisoned my bloodline. It had turned my son into a soft, entitled thief who believed he was above the law and above his own father. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out over the massive manicured back lawn. I thought about the men I had served with in the military decades ago. I thought about the young black men from my old neighborhood who had gone off to war to serve their country only to return home broken and completely forgotten. I thought about the homeless veterans I used to see sleeping on the cold concrete outside my trucking warehouse. Those men understood loyalty. Those men understood true sacrifice. They had given their bodies and their minds for a country that often looked right past them. And while those real heroes starved in the freezing rain, my son had been sitting in this multi-million-dollar mansion complaining about his expensive lifestyle. A sudden, powerful clarity washed over my mind. I knew exactly what I had to do with the poison. I had to turn it into medicine. I pulled my secure cell phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had kept in my contacts for years. It was the direct line for a man named Reverend Thomas. Thomas ran one of the most respected and dedicated charitable foundations in the city of Atlanta. His organization specialized in helping displaced and homeless veterans find their footing in the civilian world. He was a man of absolute integrity who stretched every single donated dollar to its absolute limit. He answered the phone on the second ring. I did not waste time with small talk. I told him my name and I told him I had a massive physical asset that I wanted to transfer entirely into his control. I walked through the empty hallways of the second floor while I explained my vision to him. I told Thomas that I wanted to convert the entire sprawling estate into a premier transitional housing facility and vocational training center specifically for homeless black veterans. I told him we could tear down the crystal chandeliers and turn the grand ballroom into a massive state-of-the-art classroom. We could convert the massive attached garages into mechanical workshops where veterans could learn diesel repair, logistics management, and heavy machinery operation. We could turn the acres of manicured back lawns into community gardens and physical rehabilitation spaces. I told him I wanted to take a house that was built on snobby, elitist exclusivity and turn it into a sanctuary for men who actually deserved a second chance at life. I wanted to name the facility the Vivian Memorial Veterans Center in honor of the only woman who ever truly understood the meaning of unconditional love. Reverend Thomas was completely speechless. He stammered on the other end of the line, asking if I was entirely serious about donating a multi-million-dollar property in the wealthiest district of Buckhead. I told him I had never been more serious in my entire life. I told him my lawyers would draft the irrevocable transfer documents by the end of the week. The wealthy neighbors would absolutely hate it. They would complain to the city council about property values and zoning laws, but with Roxanne handling the legal battle and my blind trust backing the funding, there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop us. I hung up the phone and felt a massive physical weight lift entirely off my shoulders. The crushing pressure in my chest that had plagued me for weeks completely dissolved. I had taken the ultimate symbol of my son's arrogance and repurposed it to save lives. The kingdom was officially dismantled. I walked back into the master closet and moved the heavy full-length mirror aside. I opened the steel wall safe for the very last time. The financial ledgers and the forged documents were safely locked away in Roxanne's downtown office. The safe was completely empty except for one small item resting in the very back corner. It was a simple worn wooden cigar box. I pulled the wooden box out and opened the brass latch. Inside were dozens of faded physical photographs. Pictures of Vivian smiling in the bright summer sun. Pictures of the very first delivery truck I ever bought with the rusty bumper and the peeling paint. Pictures of the small, simple life we had built together before the money complicated everything. These photographs were the only true treasure left in the entire estate. They were the only things that actually mattered. I tucked the wooden box securely under my arm and walked out of the master bedroom. I did not look back. I walked down the grand oak staircase through the massive echoing foyer and out the heavy front doors. I locked the deadbolt and walked down the stone steps to where Dexter was waiting in the idling sedan. He looked at the small wooden box under my arm and raised an eyebrow in silent question. I gave him a small, genuine smile. I told him the mansion belonged to the heroes now. I opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat. I told Dexter to take me back to the south side of Atlanta. I was going back to the small, quiet, run-down apartment where I had almost frozen to death. I was going to fix the broken door, replace the shattered furniture, and turn the heat on. That small, dusty apartment was not a punishment. It was a sanctuary. It was a place where a man could drink a simple cup of coffee in absolute peace without constantly looking over his shoulder. The engine of the sedan hummed quietly as we drove away from the towering iron gates for the last time. The sun broke through the heavy, gray winter clouds, casting a bright, warm light across the city streets. The war was officially over. The order of the world had been completely restored. I had lost a son, but I had reclaimed my own soul. And as we drove toward the south side of the city, heading toward my small, quiet home, I finally felt ready to rest. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the estate closed for the final time. I woke up this morning in my small apartment on the south side of Atlanta. The morning sun was shining brightly through the clean glass window, warming the simple wooden floor. I walked into the small kitchen and brewed a pot of strong black coffee. The apartment was quiet, but it was a comfortable, peaceful quiet. There were no expensive vanilla candles burning. There were no fake smiles or hidden agendas. Just the rich smell of fresh coffee and the steady beating of my own heart. I had replaced the broken wooden door and bought a simple new mattress. It was not a palace, but it was completely mine. Later in the afternoon, I took a slow walk down to the neighborhood park. The spring weather had finally chased away the bitter winter cold. The large trees were covered in bright green leaves, and the air smelled like fresh earth and blooming flowers. Dexter was already sitting at our usual concrete chess table under the shade of a massive oak tree. He had a wooden chessboard set up perfectly and a metal thermos of hot tea resting on the wooden bench. I sat down across from my old friend, and we began to play. We moved our carved wooden pieces across the board in comfortable silence. Chess is a beautiful game of patience and quiet strategy. It teaches you that a king is only as powerful as the moves he anticipates. We had played the greatest game of our lives, and we had protected the king. While we played our game, Dexter gave me a quiet update on the rest of the world. He still kept his ears open and his eyes closely watching the streets. He told me that my son Andre is currently working a minimum wage sanitation job for the city. Every single morning, long before the sun comes up, Andre has to put on a heavy reflective vest and ride on the back of a loud, dirty garbage truck. He spends his days picking up other people's trash, hauling heavy, dripping plastic bags in the freezing rain and the blistering heat. The man who thought he was a brilliant technology executive is now doing the exact kind of hard physical labor he used to mock me for doing. He is finally learning the true value of $1, the absolute hardest way possible. His hands are covered in thick calluses and his back aches every single night. And Chloe is no longer a high society princess. After her wealthy parents completely disowned her to save their own reputation, she fled the state of Georgia to avoid the constant public humiliation. She is currently working as a waitress in a dirty roadside diner 2 states away. She wears a cheap polyester uniform that constantly smells like stale frying oil. She spends 12 hours a day on her feet serving cheap black coffee and greasy eggs to tired truck drivers. Her soft, delicate hands are completely ruined by harsh chemical dishwater, and her elite fake friends have forgotten her name entirely. She wanted to live like a wealthy queen using stolen money, but the universe violently corrected her path. She is now serving the exact same kind of working-class men she used to look down upon with absolute disgust. The order of the world has been completely restored. Back in Buckhead, the Grand Estate has officially opened its doors to the public. The Vivian Memorial Veterans Center is fully operational. Last week, I stood on the sidewalk across the street and watched a dozen homeless black veterans walk through the heavy iron gates. They were given clean, warm beds, hot, nutritious meals, and a real chance to rebuild their broken lives. I heard the sound of heavy tools coming from the converted garages where men were learning how to repair diesel engines. I saw the pride slowly returning to their tired eyes. I turned around and walked away, knowing my late wife's memory was finally being honored in the most beautiful and permanent way possible. I spent 75 years believing that providing for my family meant protecting them from the harsh consequences of reality. I was wrong. Blind generosity does not build character, it breeds entitlement. When you allow those you love to treat you like a disposable resource, you are not sacrificing, you are actively participating in your own disrespect. I learned that true power does not come from yelling or seeking violent revenge. It comes from silence, meticulous preparation, and letting the weight of their own arrogance crush them. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer is letting them face the consequences alone. If you found value in my journey today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments section what you would have done in my situation and tell me what city you are listening from. Always remember to respect the people who built the roads you walk on. Thank you for your time, and I will see you in the next story.